At my son's luxury wedding, my new daughter-in-law slapped my wife across the face in front of 400 elite guests. She looked down at my wife's bleeding cheek and told her to get out, thinking we were just retired nobodies crashing her special day. My son just stood there and watched. He did not know that with one single phone call, I was about to wipe out his entire future, seize her family's estate, and turn their dream wedding into a federal crime scene. I am Langston, 75 years old, and the quiet architect of one of the largest private commercial real estate empires in Atlanta. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their lives piece by piece, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that disrespect should always be met with ruthless consequences. Now let me take you back to the exact moment my family was destroyed and my empire went to war. The sharp crack of skin against skin echoed over the soft jazz playing in the grand ballroom. It was a sound so sudden and violent that it seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the massive room. The jazz band on the stage stopped abruptly. The saxophone player lowered his instrument while the upright bass player slapped his hand over the thick strings to kill the vibration. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than a concrete vault. I was standing 10 feet away holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider when I saw my wife of 50 years, Josephine, stumble backward. Her custom designer glasses slipped from her face and shattered against the imported Italian marble floor. The sound of breaking glass was deafening in the heavy silence that fell over the 400 guests in attendance. Time seemed to slow down to an absolute crawl. I watched the shards of glass scatter across the floor, reflecting the light from the massive crystal chandeliers above us. I looked at Josephine. She touched her cheek where a thin line of deep red blood began to trickle down her dark skin, cut open by the massive diamond engagement ring I had paid for just 6 months ago. Josephine was 74 years old, but she still carried herself with the grace of a queen. We built our lives from nothing in the harsh streets of the city, working 3 jobs each just to keep the lights on in our tiny apartment decades ago. She was the woman who packed my lunches when I was pouring concrete in the freezing rain. And she was the woman who sat beside me in the boardroom when we made our first million. No one in my entire life had ever dared to raise a hand to her. Until tonight. Standing over her was Sutton, my brand new daughter-in-law. She was 26 years old, dressed in a custom silk gown that cost more than most people make in 5 years. Her face, which had been smiling flawlessly for the cameras all evening, was now twisted into an ugly mask of pure, arrogant disgust. "Get out of here, old woman!" Sutton spat, her voice ringing clear and sharp through the dead silence of the ballroom. "Nobody wants you here. You are ruining my perfect day." Sutton came from a family in Charleston that claimed to have old money. They were the kind of people who smiled at you with their teeth but looked at you like you were dirt on the bottom of their shoes. Sutton truly believed she was doing my son a favor by marrying him, bringing her supposed high society status to our black family. She thought I was just a retired blue-collar contractor who got lucky with a few modest investments. She thought my wife and I were an embarrassment to her carefully curated aesthetic. She had no idea that the very ground she was standing on, the $5,000 a night luxury estate hosting this reception, was owned by a shell company registered entirely in my name. I glanced over at the VIP tables where Sutton's parents, Richard and Evelyn, were seated. They did not look shocked. They did not rush forward to apologize for their daughter's violent, unprovoked outburst. Evelyn just took a slow sip of her martini, while Richard whispered something to the man next to him with a slight smirk on his face. They felt perfectly comfortable watching their daughter humiliate a black woman in public. To them, we were just the people funding the party. We were not equals. We were merely a stepping stone for their bankrupt family to maintain their wealthy facade. My eyes shifted immediately to my son, Andre. He was 28 years old, standing less than 3 feet away from the woman who had just assaulted his mother. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had shielded from the ugly realities of the world. I spent 50 years building an empire so my son would never have to bow his head to anyone. I gave him the best education, the finest clothes, and the most exclusive connections. But in my quest to protect him from hardship, I had accidentally robbed him of his spine. I waited for him to react. I waited for the fire that should be in the belly of any man whose mother has just been struck. I waited for him to step between them, to grab his wife's arm, to demand an apology, and to throw her out of the room. I waited for him to prove that the blood running through his veins was mine. But Andre did absolutely nothing. He froze. He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He gripped his crystal champagne flute so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he refused to lift his head. He refused to look at his bleeding mother. He refused to look at me. The cowardice rolling off him was a physical stench in the air. He was choosing his side, and he was doing it through his pathetic, terrified silence. He was choosing the illusion of acceptance from this racist, bankrupt family over the mother who had kissed his bruised knees and stayed up all night when he was sick as a child. In that single frozen moment, 28 years of a father's unconditional love evaporated into thin air. It was not replaced by sadness. I did not feel the urge to cry. It was replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I realized that my son was not a victim in this marriage. He was a willing accomplice. By standing there doing nothing, he was endorsing the disrespect. He was telling this arrogant little girl that she had permission to treat us like dirt beneath her expensive heels. He was proving that he was entirely unworthy of the legacy I had built for him. I did not shout. I did not rush forward to attack the girl or shake my son by his tailored lapels. Men who build empires from the ground up do not throw tantrums in public. We do not scream and cry and show our enemies our emotional cards. We calculate and we execute. I set the 2 glasses of cider down on a passing waiter's tray with steady, unshakable hands. I walked slowly across the marble floor. The crowd of wealthy elites parted for me like the Red Sea. No one dared to breathe. They just watched the old man walk toward the bride. I knelt down with my old aching joints right in front of Sutton's expensive white shoes. I carefully picked up the broken pieces of Josephine's glasses so nobody would step on them. I pulled a clean silk handkerchief from the inside pocket of my tailored suit and gently pressed it to my beautiful wife's cheek, wiping away the line of blood. Josephine looked at me. Her eyes were not filled with tears. They were perfectly calm. After 50 years of marriage and building a dynasty together from nothing, she knew exactly what was running through my mind. We had a contingency plan for everything in our corporate business, and a few years ago, we made one for our family trust. It was a plan designed to sever the rot if the branch ever became infected. She placed her warm hand over mine and nodded once. A silent, unbreakable agreement between partners. The gloves were off. I stood back up to my full height. I looked directly at Sutton. She puffed out her chest, crossing her arms and smirking at me. She was waiting for me to yell. She was waiting for the angry black man stereotype to come out so she could play the fragile victim for her wealthy white relatives who were watching from the VIP tables. She wanted me to cause a scene so she could have security throw us out of our own son's wedding. I gave her absolutely nothing. My face was a mask of pure stone. I looked at Andre, who finally managed to meet my gaze for a fraction of a second before his eyes darted away in utter shame. I did not say a single word to him. I did not need to. He was already a ghost to me. He was no longer my heir. He was just a stranger in a suit that I had paid for. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a private encrypted number that went straight to my lead wealth manager. He is a man who is paid very well to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It rang only one time before he answered. I kept my eyes locked on Sutton's smug face as I spoke 3 simple words into the receiver. Execute Directive 0. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Sutton let out a condescending little laugh, clearly thinking I was just an old man trying to sound important to save face in front of her high society friends. She thought I was ordering a taxi to take my wife home. But her laugh died in her throat a few seconds later. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed loudly through the massive hall. The heavy oak double doors leading out of the grand ballroom had just slammed shut, and the electronic deadbolts locked from the outside. The green exit signs above the doors turned red. No one was leaving. The game had just begun. 10 seconds passed after the heavy oak doors locked shut. Sutton was still standing there with that arrogant smirk on her face, completely unaware that the ground beneath her expensive silk shoes was about to crumble. Then it happened. The grand ballroom plunged into absolute darkness. The romantic jazz music that had just started playing again was cut off mid-note, leaving a sickening mechanical hum in the air. The 400 elite guests gasped in unison. A wave of panic rippled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. They were the wealthiest people in Atlanta and Charleston, and they were not used to being kept in the dark. 5 seconds later, the emergency lights kicked on. They were not the warm, golden lights of the crystal chandeliers that had bathed the room in a soft, romantic glow all evening. These were harsh, blinding industrial halogen beams, the kind of lights you see in a prison courtyard or a warehouse loading dock. They cast ugly, sharp shadows across the faces of the socialites, making their expensive makeup look cheap and their panicked expressions look grotesque. The illusion of the perfect high society wedding was instantly shattered. It was replaced by the cold, hard reality of a lockdown. Sutton spun around in a circle, looking up at the ceiling in pure confusion. Her perfect aesthetic was ruined. She demanded to know what was going on, waving her hands at the waiters who had suddenly stopped serving champagne. Andre, my pathetic son, looked just as lost. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. The venue was equipped with signal jammers for high-security corporate events, and Directive Zero had just activated them all. We were completely isolated from the outside world, and I was the only man in the room holding the remote control. From the shadows near the catering kitchen, the venue manager stepped forward. His name was Marcus. He was a highly trained professional who had worked for my private management firm for 10 years. He walked with a stiff military posture, holding a wireless microphone. The harsh halogen lights reflected off his bald head. He did not look at the bride or the groom. He did not look at the screaming guests. He looked directly at me. I gave him a fraction of a nod. Marcus tapped the microphone twice. The heavy thud echoed through the massive speakers, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of emotion. "May I have your immediate attention? Please remain calm. Due to an instant and catastrophic payment failure, all services for this event have been legally terminated. The catering staff, the musicians, and the hospitality crew are now off the clock. This private property is now officially closed. You have exactly 10 minutes to evacuate the premises before the local authorities arrive to arrest anyone remaining for criminal trespassing. Please proceed to the exits in an orderly fashion." The silence that followed his announcement was absolute. No one breathed. Then the room exploded into chaos. Women in diamond necklaces shrieked. Men in custom suits began shouting at the staff. Sutton stood frozen in the center of the dance floor, her jaw practically hitting the marble. She grabbed Andre's arm and shook him, demanding that he fix this immediately. She screamed at him to call the bank, to throw his platinum credit card at the manager, to do whatever it took to save her perfect night. But Andre just stared at his wallet, knowing deep down that every piece of plastic inside it was tied to the empire I built, and I had just burned it all to the ground. Sutton had made a fatal miscalculation when she decided to marry my son. She looked at me and saw an old black man who worked with his hands. She knew I had started out as a blue-collar contractor decades ago, pouring concrete and fixing roofs in the blistering Georgia heat. She assumed I was just a lucky retiree who managed to save enough pennies to put my son through a good school. She thought she was the one bringing prestige to this family with her empty Charleston pedigree. She did not know that the concrete I poured became the foundation of a real estate monopoly. She did not know that the holding company she wrote the $5,000 a night check to for this luxury estate was just one of 30 shell companies I owned. I owned the manicured lawns she walked on. I owned the crystal chandeliers hanging above her head. I owned the very marble floor where she had just shattered my wife's glasses. When she insisted on booking this exact estate for her wedding because it was the most exclusive venue in the state, I did not say a word. I let her sign the contract. I let her feel powerful. I wanted to see how she would behave when she thought she held all the cards. Tonight she showed her true colors, and she walked right into a steel trap that I had built with my own 2 hands. Through the panicked crowd, 2 figures pushed their way forward with violent entitlement. It was Richard and Evelyn Sutton's wealthy white parents. Richard's face was red and veins bulged in his neck. Evelyn looked like a cornered animal clutching her pearl necklace. They ignored the fact that my wife was standing next to me, pressing a bloody silk handkerchief to her face. They ignored the fact that their daughter had just committed a violent assault. All they cared about was their public image and the humiliation of being kicked out of a venue in front of their country club friends. Richard marched right up to me and shoved his finger inches from my face. "Listen to me, you old fool," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I do not know what kind of cheap stunt you think you are pulling here, but I will personally see to it that you are ruined. You are embarrassing my family. You are destroying my daughter's wedding. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. I will sue you for every dime you have hidden in your little retirement fund. I will drag you through the courts until you are living on the street." Evelyn joined in her voice, a high-pitched screech that cut through the noise of the evacuating guests. "Fix this right now," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. Go tell that manager to turn the lights back on and serve the food. You people are always ruining everything with your dramatic outbursts. Tell your wife to stop crying and go wash her face in the bathroom so we can get on with the evening. You people." The words hung in the air, dripping with generations of unearned arrogance. They truly believed that because their ancestors had money, they were untouchable. They believed that they could bark orders at me, and I would simply bow my head and obey, just like my son had done. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Richard was currently drowning in $15 million of corporate debt to keep up this pathetic wealthy facade. They were screaming at the man who secretly owned the mortgage to their ancestral home. But I did not smile. I did not tell them who I really was. Not yet. The psychological torture had to be administered in precise doses to be effective. I looked at Richard. I looked at Evelyn. I let the silence stretch between us, letting their angry words echo off the cold walls. I wanted them to remember this exact moment later when they were standing in front of a bankruptcy judge. I wanted them to remember the moment they tried to intimidate a man who could buy and sell their entire bloodline before breakfast. I did not blink. I did not flinch away from Richard's pointing finger. I simply looked through him as if he were made of glass. I turned my back on the most powerful man in Charleston without uttering a single word. I placed my arm gently around Josephine's waist, pulling her close to my side. She was trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the moment. She kept her head held high, refusing to let these people see her break. We began to walk toward the heavy oak doors which Marcus had just unlocked to let the panicked herd of guests escape into the night. As we walked away, I could hear Richard screaming behind me. He was shouting that I was a coward, that I was running away. Then I heard him yell to his wife to get his phone. He was dialing 911. He was calling the police to report me for ruining the wedding. He wanted me arrested for fraud. I kept walking my arm tight around the woman I loved more than life itself. Richard had no idea that calling the police was exactly what I wanted him to do. The trap was set, the doors were open, and the predators were about to become the prey. The drive away from the estate was completely silent. The heavy rain beat against the tinted windows of my town car, washing away the remnants of what was supposed to be a night of celebration. I sat in the back seat next to Josephine, holding her hand. She still had my silk handkerchief pressed firmly against her right cheek. The bleeding had slowed, but the cut from Sutton's massive diamond ring was deep. I told my driver to skip our estate and head directly to the emergency room at Emory University Hospital in downtown Atlanta. Josephine looked at me with a tired but understanding expression. She knew exactly why we were going there. We were not going to the hospital simply to get a bandage or some pain medication. We were going there to build a weapon. In the state of Georgia, the law is very clear. If you strike a 74-year-old woman, you are not just committing a simple battery. You are committing a felony. It is classified as elder abuse. Rich white families like Sutton's are used to making their problems disappear with a few phone calls and a fat check. They think they can slap a black woman and just walk away because they assume we do not have the resources to fight back. But a certified medical report from an emergency room doctor detailing an unprovoked assault on a senior citizen is a piece of paper that no amount of old money can erase. We walked into the brightly lit emergency room. The harsh fluorescent lights were a sharp contrast to the elegant darkness of the wedding venue. The nurses immediately took us into a private examination room when they saw the blood on Josephine's face and the expensive clothes we were wearing. A young doctor came in to clean the wound. He asked what happened. I did not sugarcoat it. I did not try to protect my son's new bride. I looked the doctor right in the eye and told him that my wife was intentionally struck in the face by a 26-year-old woman named Sutton. I made sure he wrote down the exact name and the exact circumstances in his official medical chart. I stood in the corner of the small, sterile room and watched as a forensic nurse took high-resolution photographs of the laceration on Josephine's cheek. They documented the bruising that was already beginning to form around her jaw. Every flash of the camera was another nail in Sutton's coffin. I was meticulously laying the groundwork for a criminal prosecution that would completely destroy her life. I wanted every piece of evidence locked down before her bankrupt father even had a chance to hire a lawyer to spin a false narrative. Once the doctor finished stitching the cut and handing us the official paperwork, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a call from Andre. I looked at the caller ID and felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. My son had not checked on his mother once since the incident. He had not called to see if she was bleeding, if she was hurt, or if she was even safe. Instead, he was calling me because his carefully constructed world of unearned luxury was finally starting to fall apart. I stepped out of the hospital room into the quiet hallway and answered the call. I did not say hello. I just listened to the panic in his voice. Andre was standing at the Delta terminal in Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He and his new bride were supposed to be boarding a flight for their 3-week honeymoon in the Maldives. It was a trip that cost more than most people earn in an entire year, and I was the one who had paid for every single cent of it. But now he was shouting into the phone, out of breath and frantic. He demanded to know what was going on. He said they had just tried to enter the exclusive VIP lounge and the attendant had cut his membership card in half right in front of him. He was furious. He told me that when they got to the ticketing counter, the agent informed them that their first-class tickets to the Maldives had been completely canceled and the reservation was wiped from the system. He was throwing a massive tantrum in the middle of the busiest airport in the world. He told me that Sutton was crying next to him and that people were staring at them. He demanded that I call the airline right now to fix the glitch. He actually used the word glitch. He was so incredibly entitled that he could not even comprehend the concept of a consequence. He thought the universe had simply made a mistake. I let him scream and complain for 2 full minutes. I listened to his pathetic whining while I looked through the glass window of the hospital door, watching my beautiful wife hold an ice pack to her bruised face. When he finally stopped talking to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was quiet and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I told him there was no glitch. I told him that I had personally canceled the honeymoon flights while we were riding in the car to the hospital. Andre went dead silent on the other end of the line. Then he started to stammer, asking me why I would do such a thing on his wedding night. I explained it to him very simply. I told him that the black corporate American Express card in his wallet, the one he used to fund his entire lavish lifestyle, was officially dead. The account was permanently closed. I told him that his trust fund was frozen and his access to any family accounts had been entirely revoked. I told him that the moment he stood by and watched a spoiled, arrogant little girl assault his mother, he ceased to be a part of my family. And people who are not part of my family do not get to spend my money. His shock quickly turned into a violent, desperate rage. He started yelling again, but this time his voice was cracking. He told me I was being unreasonable and crazy over a stupid argument. He actually called the unprovoked assault on his mother a stupid argument. He said I was ruining his life and humiliating his wife. He threatened me, telling me that he did not need my money anyway. He screamed that they would just get an Uber and go back to his luxury penthouse in Midtown Atlanta to figure things out in the morning. He told me I would regret this when they cut me out of their lives forever. I did not argue with him. I did not try to teach him a lesson or explain the depth of my disappointment. He was far beyond saving. A man who defends the person who drew his mother's blood is a man who deserves to lose everything. So I gave him the only response his disrespect warranted. Total and absolute silence. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call right in the middle of his angry ranting. I blocked his number immediately, let him scream into the void. I walked back into the hospital room and put my phone away. Josephine looked at me and I simply nodded. She knew the cord had been cut. There is a profound kind of grief that comes with realizing your child is fundamentally broken. I had spent 28 years trying to mold him into a leader, a man of substance and character. But as I helped Josephine put her coat back on, I accepted the hard truth. I had raised a parasite, and the only way to deal with a parasite is to completely sever its food supply. We walked out of the emergency room and stepped back into the cold, rainy Atlanta night. My driver opened the door for us and we slid into the quiet sanctuary of the car. I instructed him to take us home to our estate in Buckhead. As the city lights blurred past the windows, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. For years, I had been carrying the weight of Andre's incompetence. I had been quietly fixing his mistakes, covering his massive credit card bills, and ignoring the glaring flaws in his character because I wanted to believe he would eventually mature. Tonight, Sutton had done me a massive favor. By slapping my wife, she had shattered the illusion once and for all. She forced me to wake up and see the ugly reality of who my son truly was. They thought they had won. They thought they could take my money and walk all over my blood. But they were playing checkers while I was moving the final pieces on a chessboard they did not even know existed. While my car drove smoothly toward the safety of our gated estate, I pulled out my tablet to check the security network. Andre was arrogant and stupid. but he was also predictable. Just as he had threatened, he and Sutton had taken a rideshare from the airport straight to the ultra-modern high-rise building in Midtown Atlanta where his penthouse was located. He called it his penthouse, but his name was nowhere on the deed. It belonged to my real estate portfolio, and it was fully integrated into my corporate security system. I opened the live feed from the security camera positioned right outside the front door of the penthouse. The high-definition video showed Andre and Sutton stepping out of the elevator. They looked exhausted, wet from the rain, and thoroughly miserable. Sutton was carrying her heavy wedding dress in her arms, mascara running down her face. Andre marched up to the sleek black door looking furious. He reached out to place his thumb on the biometric fingerprint scanner, expecting the door to slide open and welcome him into his multi-million-dollar sanctuary. He pressed his thumb against the glass pad. The scanner beeped a sharp, harsh tone. The circular light around the scanner did not turn its usual welcoming green. Instead, it flashed a bright, angry red. Access denied. Andre frowned and wiped his thumb on his shirt, thinking the scanner was just dirty. He pressed it again. Another harsh beep. Another red light. He tried his index finger. Red. He tried typing his emergency backup code into the glowing keypad. The screen flashed the words, "Security Lockout," in bold white letters. I sat in the back of my town car watching the live feed with a cold, steady heart as my son finally realized the terrible truth. He was locked out of his home, locked out of his wealth, and locked out of his future. The real nightmare had just begun. The rain was still pouring down on the city of Atlanta when my security team sent the first alert to my secure tablet. My son and his new bride had been completely locked out of the luxury penthouse in Midtown. With his corporate credit cards permanently deactivated and his bank accounts frozen, they had nowhere to go. They were forced to take a cheap ride share to a rundown motel right off the interstate. It was a stark contrast to the $5,000 a night estate they had just been evicted from. I imagined Sutton sitting in that damp, cheap motel room wearing a custom silk wedding gown that was now ruined by the rain and dirt. A smart person would have taken that moment to reflect on their mistakes and beg for forgiveness. But Sutton was not smart. She was arrogant, and she possessed a dangerous kind of privilege that made her believe she could never truly lose. Instead of reflecting, she pulled out her phone and decided to go to war. By 2 o'clock in the morning, a video was uploaded to her social media account. I sat in the quiet darkness of my study watching the screen as the video played. Sutton was sitting on the edge of a cheap motel bed. Her expensive makeup was intentionally smudged to make her look like a victim. She looked directly into the camera and forced her eyes to fill with tears. Her voice trembled perfectly as she began to weave a narrative built entirely on lies. She told her millions of followers that her perfect wedding day had been destroyed by an aggressive and unhinged mother-in-law. She used all the classic coded language that society has always used to demonize black women. She claimed that my wife had been hostile to her from the very beginning because of her race and her wealthy background. She looked into the lens and cried, saying that Josephine had cornered her and attacked her, forcing Sutton to act in pure self-defense to protect herself. She painted herself as the fragile, innocent bride who had just barely escaped a violent family. It was a masterful performance of weaponized victimhood. Within an hour, the video had gone completely viral. The internet loves a tragic story, especially when it features a crying young woman claiming she was wronged. I watched the view count climb into the millions. The comments section beneath the video turned into an absolute cesspool of hatred. Complete strangers who knew absolutely nothing about our lives began launching vicious racial and ageist attacks against my wife. They called Josephine a bitter old woman. They used degrading terms implying she was jealous of her beautiful young daughter-in-law. They said she belonged in a cage. They demanded that Sutton press charges against the violent thugs who ruined her wedding. I did not get angry as I read those comments. Anger is a useless emotion that clouds your judgment. Instead, I felt a deep, freezing calm settle over my mind. They were attacking a 74-year-old woman who had spent her entire life building communities and funding charities. But the public did not care about the truth. They only cared about the spectacle. Then I saw the one thing that finally killed the last remaining shred of fatherly love I had in my heart. Pinned right at the top of the comment section under the hateful video was a message from my son. Andre had used his verified account to leave a public reply for the entire world to see. He wrote that he stood by his wife. He wrote that nobody should ever have to endure the kind of abuse Sutton suffered on her wedding day. I stared at those words for a very long time. My son, the boy I had raised to be a king, had publicly sided with the woman who struck his mother. He chose to validate a racist lie rather than stand up for the woman who gave him life. He was actively participating in the public lynching of his own mother's character. In that exact moment, Andre died to me. Any thought of future rehabilitation or forgiveness was permanently erased from my mind. He was no longer a disappointed son. He was an active enemy. What the millions of people watching that video did not know was the real reason behind the altercation. They did not know what happened in the luxurious bridal suite just 1 hour before the wedding reception began. Josephine had gone up to the suite alone. She had brought a velvet box containing a vintage diamond necklace that had been in our family for decades. It was meant to be a welcoming gift for Sutton to show her that despite our differences, she was now part of our family. When Josephine quietly opened the door to the bridal suite, she did not find a nervous bride getting ready. She found Sutton sitting at the expensive mahogany vanity mirror with 3 of her wealthy bridesmaids. Spread across the glass surface of the mirror was a pile of white powder. Sutton was holding a tightly rolled $100 bill to her nose, snorting cocaine right before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. Josephine stood frozen in the doorway, but the drugs were not even the worst part of what she witnessed. Sutton was laughing loudly with her friends. She was bragging about the prenuptial agreement our corporate lawyers had forced her to sign. Sutton told her bridesmaids that she had hired her own secret lawyer to review the document. She boasted that they had found a massive loophole in the trust fund stipulations. She laughed and said she only had to endure being married to my pathetic son for exactly 1 year. After 12 months, she claimed she could trigger a divorce clause that would entitle her to half of the $50 million trust fund. She referred to Andre as a stupid meal ticket and called our family a bunch of gullible fools who were desperate for white validation. My wife heard every single word. Josephine did not scream and she did not throw a fit. She walked calmly into the room and placed the velvet box on the table. Sutton froze, dropping the rolled-up bill when she realized she had been caught. Josephine looked her right in the eye. She told Sutton to wash her face, pack her bags, and leave the estate immediately. She promised that if Sutton walked out the back door quietly, we would handle the cancellation of the wedding with dignity and keep her drug use a secret. But Sutton was high on cocaine and drunk on her own arrogance. She thought she was untouchable. Instead of leaving, she fixed her makeup, put on her smile, and marched down to the grand ballroom to force the wedding to continue. When Josephine approached her later on the dance floor to quietly demand that she stop the charade, Sutton panicked. Realizing her massive payday was about to slip through her fingers, she decided to strike first. She slapped my wife in front of 400 people to create a chaotic distraction, hoping to spin the narrative exactly as she was doing now on social media. She thought her plan was working flawlessly. She thought the viral video would pressure us into giving her whatever she wanted to make the public relations nightmare go away. She thought we were soft billionaires who would pay any price to protect our corporate image. She did not realize that I had spent the last 40 years swimming with sharks, and I knew exactly how to bleed a predator dry. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy rain clouds, casting a pale light over our estate. Josephine was resting quietly in the master bedroom. I was sitting at the massive oak desk in my private office reviewing the digital footprint of every single shell company tied to Sutton's family. The intercom on my desk buzzed softly. My head of security informed me that a vehicle had just pulled up to the main security gate. I authorized them to let the vehicle through. 5 minutes later, my lead corporate lawyer walked into my office. He was a ruthless man who rarely showed emotion, but this morning he had a tight, rigid look on his face. He walked over to my desk and placed a thick stack of legal documents right in front of me. He told me that Sutton and her bankrupt father had not wasted a single second. They had hired a sleazy, high-profile litigator known for public smear campaigns. The documents on my desk were a formally drafted lawsuit. Sutton was suing me and my wife for $10 million, claiming severe emotional distress, public humiliation, and false imprisonment due to the doors being locked at the venue. The lawsuit included a demand for an immediate settlement warning that if we did not pay, the viral video would just be the beginning of a massive media tour to destroy my corporate empire. I looked down at the ridiculous legal papers, a $10 million extortion attempt wrapped in a civil lawsuit. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought the threat of public ruin would force me to open my vault and hand them a fortune. I slowly reached out and tapped my fingers against the thick stack of paper. A cold, genuine smile finally spread across my face. They had taken the bait perfectly. The lawsuit gave me the exact legal excuse I needed to open the vault, but they were not going to find any money inside. They were only going to find their absolute destruction. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock the following morning at the downtown offices of my primary legal counsel. My corporate lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, was a man who possessed the warmth of a great white shark and the precision of a military sniper. His office was located on the 50th floor of a towering glass skyscraper that I happened to own through a subsidiary holding company. The room was entirely soundproofed, featuring a massive mahogany conference table and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Atlanta skyline. I sat alone at the head of the table in a high-backed leather chair. Josephine was safely at home, resting in our quiet garden. I did not want her to breathe the same air as the people who were about to walk through those heavy oak doors. I wanted to handle this execution myself. At exactly 10:15, the heavy glass doors swung open. They were 15 minutes late, a cheap power play designed to make me angry. Sutton and Andre marched into the room, flanked by a man who looked like he belonged on a late-night television commercial. He was their newly hired litigator, wearing a flashy pinstripe suit, too much cologne, and an arrogant smile. Sutton looked entirely different from the crying, broken victim she had portrayed on social media just hours before. She was wearing a tailored designer dress, carrying a luxury leather handbag, and projecting an air of absolute triumph. She thought she had me backed into a corner. She thought her viral video and her $10 million lawsuit were the ultimate weapons that would force me to surrender. Andre walked in right behind her, looking down at the polished floor, just like he did at the wedding. He pulled out a chair for his wife and sat down beside her, refusing to make eye contact with me. He looked exhausted and terrified, but he was still foolish enough to follow her lead. He still believed that his status as my only son would protect him from utter ruin. The sleazy litigator did not even bother to introduce himself properly. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto the mahogany table and leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the polished wood. He spoke with a loud, obnoxious voice that echoed in the quiet room, trying to dominate the physical space. He told me that his clients were willing to make the entire public relations nightmare go away right now. He said they were deeply traumatized by the events at the wedding and the emotional distress my wife had supposedly inflicted upon Sutton. He stated that the $10 million lawsuit would be officially dropped and the viral internet video deleted if we simply agreed to their very reasonable terms. Their terms were not a structured payment plan. Their terms were an immediate dissolution of Andre's trust fund. Sutton crossed her legs and smiled at me across the table, a look of pure, unadulterated greed flashing in her eyes. She demanded that we unlock the $50 million trust fund that Andre was supposedly entitled to receive upon his marriage. She explicitly detailed how the money would be divided. She said that $10 million would go directly to her as a tax-free settlement for her suffering. The remaining $40 million would be transferred into a joint account for her and Andre to start their new life away from our toxic, abusive family. She actually used the word toxic. She sat there in a building I owned, demanding $50 million of my hard-earned money because she had assaulted my wife and played the victim on the internet. I did not say a single word. I did not lean forward or show any sign of intimidation. I did not even blink. I simply looked at Mr. Caldwell, who was sitting completely still to my right. Men with real power do not need to raise their voices to win an argument. We let the paperwork do the screaming. Caldwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up a single manila folder from his immaculate desk. He did not open his briefcase. He did not pull out stacks of defense files or counter lawsuits. He only had that one thin folder. Mr. Caldwell slid the folder slowly across the smooth mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of the flashy litigator. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood was the only noise in the room. Caldwell spoke in a voice so calm and quiet that the other lawyer had to lean in to hear him. Caldwell informed them that they were operating under a massive and highly embarrassing delusion. He told Sutton that she had married a man based on a fundamental misunderstanding of wealth architecture. The litigator opened the folder and began to read. Sutton leaned over his shoulder, her smug smile faltering slightly as her eyes scanned the dense legal jargon. Mr. Caldwell explained it to them in plain English, making sure every word cut deep. He said that Andre did not own a $50 million trust fund. Andre did not own a single cent of the family wealth. The trust fund was established decades ago as a fully discretionary generation-skipping trust. Caldwell clarified what that meant. Andre was merely a discretionary beneficiary. That meant he had absolutely no legal right to demand a single payout ever. Every dollar Andre had ever spent, every sports car he had ever driven, and every luxury apartment he had ever lived in was granted purely at the discretion of the trustees. And the sole trustees of that massive account were myself and Josephine. We held the keys to the kingdom, and Andre was nothing more than a peasant who had been allowed to sleep in the castle. The law was absolute. Andre could not force a payout. He could not borrow against the principal. He could not pledge the assets to a bank. And he certainly could not hand it over to a greedy bride who thought she had outsmarted a man who built an empire from concrete and steel. I watched the color drain completely out of Andre's face. He began to breathe heavily. He had spent his entire adult life bragging to his friends and his new wife about his massive trust fund. He had paraded around Atlanta high society acting like a billionaire, when in reality he was just a dependent living on an allowance that could be revoked at any second. He had sold Sutton a fantasy, and now the bill was due. Sutton turned to look at Andre with wide, angry eyes. The illusion of her grand payday was shattering before her very eyes. She realized in that exact moment that the golden goose she thought she had trapped was actually completely penniless. The $50 million she had built her entire future around the money she had snorted drugs and bragged about in the bridal suite was locked inside a vault that she could never force open. She had thrown away her reputation and committed a felony for a man who had zero financial power. But Sutton was like a rat trapped in a corner. She possessed a dangerous level of arrogance that refused to accept defeat. The shock on her face quickly twisted back into a mask of pure venom. She slammed her hand down on the heavy wooden table and glared at Mr. Caldwell. She laughed a harsh, grating sound that filled the silent room. She told my lawyer that he was bluffing and that she was not some uneducated girl who could be intimidated by fancy corporate words. She turned her attention back to her litigator and demanded that he explain the real law to us. Sutton proudly proclaimed that it did not matter if the trust was discretionary. She said that she and Andre were legally married now. She brought up community property laws and marital asset division, acting as if she had suddenly become an expert in family law overnight. She insisted that since the trust was established for Andre's benefit the moment they signed their marriage license, she became legally entitled to a portion of its disbursements to maintain her marital standard of living. She threatened to drag the trust into a massive, messy divorce settlement. She claimed she would force a family court judge to order a massive payout based on the lifestyle she was promised. Her sleazy lawyer nodded along, trying to regain his footing after being completely blindsided. He had likely taken this case on a contingency fee, expecting a quick multi-million-dollar settlement from a terrified family trying to protect their public image. Now he was staring down the barrel of a long, drawn-out legal war against a billionaire with unlimited resources. But he puffed out his chest and stated that a judge would not look kindly upon a wealthy family hoarding assets while leaving a young newlywed couple destitute, especially after a highly publicized physical altercation. They thought they had found a loophole. They thought that by weaponizing the family court system they could force my hand and pry the vault open through sheer public pressure and legal attrition. I looked at my son, who was now sweating profusely, staring at the manila folder as if it were a loaded gun. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake, but he was too paralyzed by fear to speak. Sutton, on the other hand, was still smirking, believing her community property argument was the winning checkmate. She thought she had outmaneuvered the old man. I gave Mr. Caldwell another slow, deliberate nod. The game was over. It was time to spring the final trap and watch the steel jaws snap shut around their entire future. Mr. Caldwell did not argue with their legal theories. He did not raise his voice or tell them they were wrong about community property. He simply reached across the table and flipped the heavy legal document to page 47. He tapped his expensive gold fountain pen twice against a specific paragraph highlighted in bold black ink. He looked directly into Sutton's arrogant eyes and told her that community property laws did not apply to a beneficiary who had just triggered the ironclad clause. Mr. Caldwell did not blink when Sutton threw her ridiculous community property argument across the heavy mahogany table. He did not raise his voice to argue with a woman who clearly possessed more arrogance than actual legal knowledge. He simply sat there with the terrifying calm of a man who held all the winning cards. He did not need to shout. He let the silence stretch out, allowing her unearned confidence to hang in the cold, air-conditioned room before he completely destroyed it. Section 8 of the family trust agreement was a provision I had personally insisted upon when my real estate empire first crossed the billion-dollar mark. I grew up in a harsh world where money routinely tore families apart. I watched greed turn brothers into bitter enemies and children into ungrateful parasites. Josephine and I had promised each other that the wealth we built from the ground up, working multiple jobs and sacrificing our youth, would never be used to fund our own destruction. We instructed our legal team to draft a poison pill into the very foundation of the trust fund. It was a fail-safe mechanism designed to completely sever the financial artery if the beneficiary ever proved themselves unworthy of our legacy. Mr. Caldwell smoothed the heavy parchment paper with his hands. He looked directly at Sutton's sleazy litigator and told him to listen very carefully to the exact wording on page 47. Caldwell began to read aloud, his steady voice echoing off the glass walls of the high-rise boardroom. He read Section 8, the morality clause. The legal language was absolute and unforgiving. It stated that any physical or psychological harm inflicted upon the grantors, meaning myself and Josephine, by a beneficiary or their legally wedded spouse would result in instantaneous and permanent disinheritance. Caldwell did not stop there. He continued reading the precise stipulations of the clause, ensuring they understood the gravity of their situation. The document mandated that the moment an act of aggression was documented, the beneficiary would be completely stripped of all current and future access to the trust assets. There was no grace period. There was no mandatory arbitration required to prove intent. There was no Board of Trustees vote needed to enforce the penalty. The disinheritance was triggered automatically the exact second Sutton raised her hand and struck my wife in front of 400 witnesses. The silence that blanketed the boardroom was so profound you could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system above us. The flashy litigator who had marched into my building demanding $10 million just moments ago was suddenly completely speechless. He stared at the manila folder as if it had magically transformed into a venomous snake. He knew exactly what that clause meant. Any competent lawyer would know that a generation-skipping discretionary trust fortified with a strict morality clause is virtually impenetrable. Sutton, however, was not a lawyer. She was a spoiled child who had spent her entire life manipulating people to get what she wanted. She looked back and forth between Mr. Caldwell and her own attorney, waiting for someone to object. When her attorney remained silent, she let out a loud scoff of disbelief. She leaned across the table and told Mr. Caldwell that a piece of paper could not just magically erase her husband's money. She reiterated her flawed belief that she was protected by marital rights. She arrogantly told my lawyer that her father would tie this up in family court for the next 10 years if he had to. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at her with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. He calmly explained to her that she could not tie up assets that no longer existed. He told her that as of midnight on the evening of the wedding, all accounts associated with Andre had been legally dissolved and absorbed back into the primary corporate holding company. Caldwell pointed out that the official medical report from Emory University Hospital documenting the felony assault on Josephine had already been formally filed and attached to the trust dissolution papers. The legal requirements for the morality clause had been met flawlessly. The litigator sitting next to Sutton slowly began to close his leather briefcase. He had taken this case expecting a quick and easy payday from an old man trying to avoid a public scandal. Now he realized he had walked into a legal slaughterhouse. He knew that fighting a morality clause backed by a documented emergency room visit and 400 eyewitnesses was a completely unwinnable battle. Furthermore, he realized that the wealthy young couple he was representing had absolutely no money to pay his exorbitant hourly legal fees. He clicked the brass locks on his briefcase shut and pushed his chair back from the table, preparing to abandon a sinking ship. Sutton watched her attorney backing away, and genuine panic finally began to claw at her throat. The smug, victorious smile that had been plastered on her face since she walked into the building completely melted away. Her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She turned her head slowly and looked at Andre. My son was sitting completely paralyzed in his high-backed leather chair. The terrifying reality of his situation was finally crushing him under its immense weight. For 28 years, Andre had lived safely inside a protective bubble of limitless wealth. He had never applied for a mortgage. He had never worried about paying a credit card bill. He had never even held a real job. His entire identity was wrapped up in the fact that he was the golden heir to my massive real estate empire. He wore bespoke suits, drove imported Italian sports cars, and threw thousands of dollars away on expensive champagne just to impress his shallow friends. But underneath all the expensive clothes and the unearned arrogance, Andre was absolutely nothing. He had no real-world skills to fall back on. He had no professional network outside of the people who were only using him for my money. He was just a weak, pathetic boy who had stood by and watched his mother bleed because he was too much of a coward to stand up to his spoiled bride. And now, because of that exact cowardice, he had lost the one thing that made him valuable to the woman sitting next to him. I sat at the head of the table and watched my son hyperventilate. His chest was heaving and heavy beads of sweat were forming on his forehead. He looked across the massive table at me, his eyes wide with pure terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to beg for a second chance. He wanted to tell me that it was all a big mistake and that he truly loved his mother. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not glare at him in anger. I did not smile triumphantly at his ruin. I simply looked at him with the cold, indifferent stare of a man looking at a complete stranger on the street. Sutton was watching him too. I could see the gears turning violently inside her head as she processed the catastrophic shift in her reality. She had spent months plotting and scheming behind our backs. She had endured what she considered to be a degrading relationship with a black man just so she could secure her luxurious financial future. She had snorted cocaine in the bridal suite and bragged to her friends about the millions she was going to extract from our gullible family. She had slapped an elderly woman in public and launched a viral smear campaign on the internet, all to force my hand and secure her payout. And it had all been for absolutely nothing. She had not married a billionaire heir. She had married a broke, unemployed man with no access to housing, no credit cards, and no future. She was legally bound to a massive liability. The $50 million payday she had dreamed of was gone forever, locked away behind an impenetrable legal wall that she could never breach. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Her face turned pale, making the heavy makeup around her eyes look harsh and unnatural. The grand illusion of her high society superiority shattered right there in my corporate boardroom. She was a woman drowning in debt from a bankrupt family, and she had just legally tied herself to a man who could not even afford to buy her a cup of cheap coffee. The silence in the room stretched on, becoming thick and suffocating. Sutton's breathing became fast and erratic. She slowly stood up from her chair, her designer dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. She did not look at me. She did not look at Mr. Caldwell or her fleeing attorney. She turned her entire body toward my son. The transition was immediate and terrifying to witness. The fragile woman who had just posted a crying video on the internet claiming she loved her husband and was defending their sacred marriage completely vanished. The victim mask fell off, revealing the vicious, calculating predator underneath. All the anger, all the public humiliation, and all the crushing disappointment that she was feeling instantly locked onto Andre. She looked down at him, sitting there sweating and terrified, and her eyes narrowed into dark slits of pure hatred. She realized that he had known about the discretionary nature of the trust all along. She realized that he had lied to her about his level of control over the money just to get her to marry him. He had played the role of a powerful billionaire, but he was nothing more than an obedient lapdog who had just been kicked out of the house. Sutton clenched her fists at her sides until her knuckles turned white. She leaned down, placing her hands on the armrests of his chair, trapping him. Her face was only inches away from Andre's sweating forehead. The boardroom was perfectly silent, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The trap I had set had worked flawlessly. I did not have to raise my voice or lift a single finger to destroy them. I simply removed the money and let their own toxic greed tear them apart from the inside. Sutton took a deep, ragged breath, preparing to unleash hell on the man she had sworn to love just 48 hours ago. Sutton stormed out of the boardroom, leaving her flashy litigator behind. She did not wait for Andre. She marched to the elevator, her designer heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. Andre stumbled after her like a lost dog. He was completely numb. The $50 million he thought was his birthright was gone forever. When they reached the ground floor, the reality of their situation hit them like a heavy freight train. They had no car to take them home. Andre's black corporate credit card was dead. Sutton had to use her own nearly maxed-out personal credit card to call a cheap rideshare. They stood on the busy sidewalk in the humid Atlanta heat, waiting for a battered sedan to pick them up. It was a humiliating downgrade for a couple who had flown exclusively on private jets just a week prior. Sutton sat in the back of the cheap car, biting her nails as her mind raced to find a way out of the massive hole she had dug for herself. She told the driver to take them to the Piedmont Elite Country Club. It was the oldest and most exclusive private club in the city, a place where her parents Richard and Evelyn spent every single afternoon drinking expensive gin and networking with other bankrupt aristocrats. Sutton believed that her family name would save her. She believed her father would simply write a massive check to fix the problem and provide her with the luxury she deserved. She dragged Andre along not out of love or loyalty, but because he was the only piece of leverage she had left. The drive to the country club took 45 minutes. The silence in the back of the car was suffocating and heavy. Andre stared out the window, watching the city he used to own pass him by. He was a prince who had just been exiled from his own kingdom. Sutton did not even look at him. She was aggressively typing on her phone, ignoring the fact that she was the one who had caused this entire disaster by assaulting my wife in public. When the rideshare finally pulled up to the grand wrought iron gates of the Piedmont Elite Country Club, the guard at the booth hesitated. He was used to seeing imported luxury vehicles roll through, not a dented sedan. Sutton had to roll down the window and scream her maiden name at the guard before he finally lifted the heavy gate. The club was a sprawling colonial-style estate surrounded by perfectly manicured golf courses and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It was a towering monument to old Southern wealth and white exclusivity. It was also a place where people who looked like me and Andre were traditionally only allowed to enter through the service doors to carry trays of food. Andre had always felt deeply uncomfortable here, but he had ignored that feeling because he wanted so desperately to fit into Sutton's world. Now walking up the pristine white steps of the clubhouse in his wrinkled suit, he looked exactly like the outsider they had always considered him to be. Sutton stormed through the heavy mahogany doors of the clubhouse, bypassing the greeting staff and marching directly toward the private dining terrace. Andre followed closely behind, his head hung low in shame. Out on the terrace, the afternoon sun was shining brightly over the green golf course. Richard and Evelyn were seated at their usual corner table under a large canvas umbrella. They were drinking expensive wine and laughing loudly with another wealthy white couple. When Richard saw his daughter approaching, his fake polite smile faltered. He noticed her disheveled appearance. He noticed the sheer panic burning in her eyes. Sutton did not care that her parents were entertaining important guests. She walked right up to the table, grabbed an empty chair, and collapsed into it, breathing heavily. She told her parents that they needed to talk immediately in private. Richard excused himself, and Evelyn followed them to a secluded lounge area deep inside the clubhouse. Andre stood awkwardly by the doorway, feeling entirely out of place and completely powerless. Sutton did not waste any time. She looked at her father and told him everything that had just happened in Mr. Caldwell's office. She explained that the $50 million trust fund was a complete illusion. She told them about the strict morality clause and how the medical report from the hospital had completely triggered my legal right to disinherit Andre permanently. She confessed that Andre was entirely cut off from the family fortune, and that they were currently locked out of their luxury penthouse with no money to their name. Evelyn's hand flew to her pearl necklace, clutching it so tightly the string looked ready to snap. She gasped loudly, her eyes darting toward Andre with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Richard stood perfectly still. The color slowly drained from his face as the crushing reality of his daughter's words washed over him. He had eagerly given his blessing to this marriage because he believed Andre was the golden key to saving his own failing business empire. Richard was quietly drowning in $15 million of toxic corporate debt, and he had been banking on his new billionaire-in-laws to quietly bail him out to avoid a highly public bankruptcy. He had tolerated my family and smiled at my wife because he thought we were his financial salvation. Now he was looking at a son-in-law who was poorer than the waiters serving drinks on the terrace outside. The heavy silence in the private room was finally broken by Richard's cold, cruel laughter. It was not a laugh of amusement. It was the bitter, ugly sound of an arrogant man who realized he had been completely outplayed by someone he considered beneath him. Richard turned his gaze slowly toward Andre. The mask of the progressive, tolerant white liberal completely evaporated in an instant. There was no more fake politeness. There was no more pretending that he respected Andre as an equal man. Richard looked at my son with absolute seething disgust. He stepped closer to Andre, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "You mean to tell me," Richard hissed, his voice dripping with venom, "that you are absolutely nothing? You paraded around my house drinking my expensive scotch, asking for my daughter's hand in marriage, and you do not even own the suit on your back." Andre tried to speak, but his voice cracked in his throat. He stammered, trying to explain that he did not know about the discretionary clause, that he honestly thought the money would eventually be his to control. But Richard did not want to hear pathetic apologies. Evelyn stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly sneer. She looked Andre up and down as if he were a piece of rotting garbage that had blown into her pristine country club. "We let you into our family," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "We compromised our prestigious social standing to let a boy like you marry our daughter because you promised her a life of luxury, and now you expect us to clean up your financial mess. You are absolutely pathetic." The racial slurs came next. They did not shout them loudly enough for the other club members to hear. They did not need to. They delivered them with a quiet, casual cruelty that made them even more devastating to hear. Richard used horrible words that stripped away all of Andre's basic dignity, reminding him exactly what this old money family truly thought of a black man without a massive bank account to shield him. Andre stood there taking every insult, every racial epithet, every degrading comment without saying a single word to defend himself. He realized in that agonizing moment that Sutton's family had never loved him. They had never even liked him. They had merely tolerated his skin color because it came attached to my black corporate credit card. The moment the credit card was declined, his humanity was completely revoked. It was a brutal, agonizing awakening for a boy who had spent his whole life trying to buy the respect of people who secretly despised him. Sutton did not defend her husband. She did not tell her father to stop using those hateful, racist words. She simply sat in her chair, crying crocodile tears, feeling sorry for herself. Richard turned his attention back to his daughter, his eyes cold and calculating. He told Sutton to wipe her face and stop acting like a child. He instructed her to take her diamond wedding ring off immediately. "You are not going to stay married to this useless street rat," Richard commanded, pointing a stiff, rigid finger at Andre. "You are going to file for divorce first thing tomorrow morning. But we are not walking away from this empty-handed. Your arrogant father-in-law thinks he can play games with our family. He thinks he can embarrass us in front of the entire city, lock you out of a venue, and hide his money behind a piece of paper. He does not know who he is dealing with." Richard began to pace the floor of the private lounge, his arrogant confidence slowly returning to his posture. He promised his daughter that he would personally fund the most vicious corporate divorce attorneys in the entire state of Georgia. He vowed to file endless discovery motions to subpoena every single financial record my company had ever produced and to drag my corporate reputation through the mud. He told Sutton that they would sue me for hiding marital assets, for emotional distress, and for anything else his expensive lawyers could possibly dream up. He swore that he would bleed me dry through relentless corporate litigation until I was forced to offer a massive multi-million-dollar settlement just to make the public relations nightmare go away. He looked at Andre one last time and told him to get out of the country club before he had the armed security guards throw him out by the back of his neck. Andre turned around and walked out the door, leaving his wife behind without saying a single word. He was completely broken. While my son was being thrown out of the country club and Richard was busy plotting his grand legal war, I was sitting quietly in my private office, overlooking the Atlanta skyline. I had anticipated Richard's reaction perfectly. I knew that a desperate, arrogant man would choose to attack rather than retreat. I knew he would threaten to use his old money connections to destroy my business through the court system. What Richard did not know was that his old money was already completely gone. I poured myself a cup of dark black coffee and walked over to my heavy oak desk. My secure corporate iPad was sitting on the polished wood. The screen suddenly lit up with a high-priority notification from my shadow hedge fund manager. I picked up the device and read the single line of text on the bright screen. The trap had been perfectly primed. It was time to pull the secondary trigger and show Richard exactly who owned his world. Richard was a man who truly believed that his social status and his skin color made him completely bulletproof. After throwing my son out of the country club, he sat back down at the shaded table with his daughter. He ordered another glass of expensive gin and told Sutton to wipe her tears. He promised her that the nightmare was over and that he was going to personally ensure her financial survival. He told her that he would hire the most ruthless corporate divorce attorneys in the state to tear my family apart. To prove his power, Richard pulled his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket and opened his private banking application. He intended to transfer $500,000 directly into Sutton's personal checking account. It was meant to be a swift down payment for a luxury condominium in the city and a retainer for the legal team. He typed the massive amount into the screen with absolute arrogant confidence and pressed the button to execute the wire transfer. He took a sip of his drink, waiting for the confirmation screen. Instead, a red error message flashed brightly across the glass. The notification simply read, "Insufficient funds and account frozen." Richard frowned in annoyance, assuming it was nothing more than a simple banking glitch. Men of his supposed caliber do not get error messages on their accounts. He immediately dialed the direct line to his personal wealth manager at the regional bank in Charleston. He fully expected the man to answer on the first ring with groveling apologies and an immediate fix, but the banker on the other end of the line did not apologize. His voice was shaking with pure panic. The manager informed Richard that the wire transfer was not blocked by a technical error. He explained that all corporate accounts, personal checking accounts, and emergency lines of credit tied to the family name were legally frozen by a direct court order. A primary creditor holding the massive debt for Richard's failing logistics company had just executed an emergency freeze on all assets, citing a critical breach of financial covenants. Richard felt the blood completely drain from his face. His hand trembled so violently that he dropped his crystal glass onto the patio floor. He ended the call without another word and stood up, leaving his daughter sitting alone at the table in confusion. He ran out of the country club, threw himself into his luxury car, and drove recklessly toward his corporate headquarters. While Richard was speeding down the highway in a blind panic, I was sitting comfortably in my quiet office overlooking the Atlanta skyline, pouring myself a second cup of dark coffee. I had been waiting for this exact moment for 3 long months. When Andre first brought Sutton to our estate and proudly announced his engagement, my instincts immediately warned me that something was terribly wrong with her family. I did not smile and nod like a foolish old man eager for white validation. Instead, I hired the most thorough and ruthless private investigator in the state of Georgia. I paid him a massive premium to bypass the public records and dig deep into the pristine background of Sutton's supposedly wealthy old money family. The investigator returned a week later with a goldmine of pathetic secrets. He uncovered a truth that was both hilariously tragic and incredibly useful for my long-term planning. The old money prestige that Richard and Evelyn constantly bragged about at their country club dinners was nothing more than a carefully maintained mirage. Their massive ancestral mansion in Charleston was mortgaged to the absolute limit, but their real vulnerability lay in Richard's primary business. His regional logistics and trucking company had been quietly bleeding cash for the past 5 years. Richard was an arrogant man who refused to adapt to modern technology. He still ran his dispatch operations on outdated paper ledgers and refused to upgrade his decaying fleet of delivery trucks. To cover his massive operating losses and maintain his luxurious high society lifestyle, Richard had taken out incredibly toxic loans from various secondary banks. He had accumulated exactly $15 million in high-interest short-term corporate debt. He was a man standing on a trap door with a heavy rope tied around his neck, just waiting for someone to pull the lever. I decided that I was going to be the man whose hand rested on that lever. I did not tell Andre about my discovery because my son was too weak and would have ruined the plan. Instead, I called my shadow wealth manager and gave him a very specific set of instructions. We set up a proxy hedge fund registered in Delaware with absolutely zero public ties to my name or my real estate empire. Using this ghost entity, my manager aggressively approached the regional banks that held Richard's toxic loans. Those banks were absolutely desperate to get the failing debt off their books before the company officially filed for bankruptcy. They happily sold the debt to my proxy fund for pennies on the dollar without ever knowing who the real buyer was. Over the course of 3 quiet weeks, I successfully acquired total and absolute control over Richard's entire financial existence. By the time Sutton put on her white dress and walked down the aisle, I was already the undisputed master of her family's fate. I became their largest and most dangerous creditor. Richard burst through the heavy glass doors of his corporate headquarters completely out of breath. The building was aging and poorly maintained, a physical reflection of his failing leadership. He ran straight into the executive boardroom, where his chief financial officer was already sitting, surrounded by stacks of financial documents and looking entirely defeated. The officer looked up at Richard with pale, terrified eyes. He explained that an unknown Delaware hedge fund had just declared a total default on all their consolidated loans. The fund had legally frozen the operating accounts and was preparing to seize the physical assets of the company. The officer explained that they had effectively been cut off from their oxygen supply. The company could no longer make payroll, they could not buy fuel for their delivery trucks, and they could not even pay the mortgage on the Charleston family estate. Richard was absolutely furious. He relied heavily on his skin color and his privilege to bully people into submission. He believed that he could intimidate any corporate entity over the phone. He demanded the direct contact number for the hedge fund manager listed on the legal injunction. He ordered his financial officer to dial the number and put the call on speakerphone right there in the middle of the boardroom. Richard adjusted his expensive tie and cleared his throat. He fully intended to use his country club charm and empty promises to negotiate a grace period. He truly thought he could buy his way out of a $15 million crisis with a fake smile and a few arrogant demands. The phone rang twice before the line connected, but the call did not route to a busy corporate office in Delaware. The call was routed directly to the secure smartphone sitting right in front of me on my heavy oak desk in Atlanta. I picked up the device and listened to the heavy, panicked breathing echoing through the speaker. Richard barked his name with forced authority and demanded to know exactly who he was speaking to. He demanded that his corporate accounts be unfrozen, immediately threatening massive retaliatory lawsuits and claiming he had powerful political connections in the state government. He yelled that they had no right to freeze his assets without a formal hearing. I let him rant and scream for a full continuous minute. I let him completely exhaust his false authority and run out of breath. The silence on the secure line became heavy and terrifying. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, deep, and entirely devoid of any emotion. I asked him a very simple question. I asked Richard if the expensive drinks at the Piedmont Elite Country Club were refreshing. I asked him if he still felt comfortable using racial slurs against a black man now that his bank accounts were empty. The silence that instantly filled his boardroom was absolute and chilling. I could practically hear his heart stop beating through the phone. Richard recognized my steady voice immediately. The arrogant white knight who had promised to destroy my family just an hour ago was now suddenly paralyzed by the terrifying realization of his own utter vulnerability. Richard began to stammer heavily. His brain simply could not process the catastrophic reality of the situation. He asked me how this was even possible. He asked what kind of illegal trick I was playing on his family. I told him very clearly that there were no tricks. I explained that while he was busy pretending to be a billionaire aristocrat, I was busy legally purchasing his entire reality. I informed him that the Delaware hedge fund did not exist, and that I personally owned every single piece of toxic debt attached to his failing name. I told him that I owned the loans on his decaying trucks. I owned the mortgage on his corporate headquarters. And most importantly, I owned the deed to his precious ancestral mansion in Charleston. The realization completely broke him. His progressive mask, his aristocratic pride, his racist superiority, all of it crumbled into pathetic dust in a matter of seconds. He was completely at the mercy of the man he secretly despised. Richard started to beg. His voice cracked and whined like a beaten dog. He pleaded for a private meeting. He asked for a chance to sit down and discuss a reasonable payment plan like civilized men. I refused his request immediately. I told Richard that civilized men do not strike elderly women in the face, and they certainly do not call my son degrading names in a country club. I told him he lost the right to be treated with respect the moment he allowed his daughter to disrespect my wife. I did not raise my voice as I delivered the final devastating blow. I informed Richard that the original loan agreements he foolishly signed included a strict financial health clause. Because his company was now officially insolvent, I had the absolute legal right to call in the entire $15 million debt immediately. I issued a formal emergency margin call right there on the open phone line. I told Richard he had exactly 48 hours to wire $15 million in cash directly into my holding account. I promised him that if the money was not transferred in full by that exact deadline, I would execute a hostile corporate takeover without any hesitation. I swore that I would seize his logistics company, liquidate every single asset he possessed, and foreclose on the Charleston estate, leaving his entire arrogant family completely homeless. I hung up the phone, leaving Richard trapped in a silent room with his absolute destruction. The morning sun cast long, heavy shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my executive office. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. The city was a machine of endless motion, and I owned a significant portion of the gears that kept it turning. My secure phone sat quietly on the center of my desk. Exactly 12 hours had passed since I issued the $15 million margin call that legally froze the entire financial existence of my new in-laws. I knew Richard would not wait the full 48 hours. Men who have spent their entire lives pretending to be powerful are always the first to break when real power is finally applied to their necks. Right on cue, the intercom on my desk buzzed with a soft chime. My executive assistant informed me that a man was standing in the lobby demanding to see me. She noted that he looked highly agitated and was refusing to leave until he spoke with the chairman. I instructed her to let him up, but I told her to make him wait in the elevator hall for exactly 20 minutes before opening the heavy glass doors to my private suite. I wanted the cold reality of his situation to sink deep into his bones. I wanted him to stare at the expensive modern art and the silent marble walls of my empire and realize that he was nothing more than a beggar standing outside the gates. When the glass doors finally opened, Richard practically stumbled into my office. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant white aristocrat who had stood in the country club less than a day ago barking racial slurs and threatening to destroy my legacy was completely gone. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was pulled loose and the top button of his collar was ripped open. His face was pale and covered in a thick layer of nervous perspiration. His hands shook violently as he clutched a leather briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield. He stopped a few feet away from my desk, breathing heavily. He looked around the massive room, taking in the sheer scale of the wealth he had foolishly tried to challenge. I did not offer him a seat. I did not offer him a glass of water. I simply remained standing behind my desk, folding my hands together and waiting for him to speak. Richard swallowed hard and tried to stand up straight, attempting to summon whatever tiny fraction of old money dignity he had left. He opened his mouth, but the booming, confident voice he used to command his country club friends had completely vanished. Instead, a pathetic, trembling whisper came out. He addressed me by my first name, trying to force a sense of familiar equality that absolutely did not exist. He told me that there had been a terrible misunderstanding between our families. He blamed the stress of the wedding and the emotional toll of the day for the harsh words he had used against my son. He actually tried to smile a sickly, desperate expression that made him look even more pathetic. He took a step closer and placed his hands flat on my desk. He begged me to look at the situation reasonably. He explained that his logistics company employed hundreds of people and that calling in the $15 million loan immediately would force him into total liquidation. He talked about his ancestral home in Charleston, the estate that had been in his family for 4 generations. He told me that if the bank foreclosed on that property, his wife would have a nervous breakdown and his social standing would be permanently destroyed. He pleaded with me man to man to extend the grace period on the loan. He promised to pay me back every single cent with maximum interest if I just gave him 6 months to restructure his failing business. I let him talk. I let him spill his desperate excuses and his empty promises all over my desk. I watched him throw away every ounce of his supposed aristocratic superiority just to save his own skin. When he finally ran out of words, he stood there panting, waiting for me to show him the mercy he had so brutally denied my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single trace of anger or vindictive joy. The most terrifying thing a powerful man can do is remain completely empty of emotion. I looked Richard directly in the eyes and told him that his logistics company was a rotting corpse, and his family legacy was an illusion built on debt. I told him that $15 million was the amount of money my holding company generates in a single fiscal quarter. The money meant absolutely nothing to me, but I knew it was the only oxygen keeping him alive. I informed him that I was not going to forgive the debt. I was not going to give him a 6-month extension. However, I told him I would halt the immediate liquidation of his company and stop the foreclosure on his Charleston estate under one very specific and non-negotiable condition. Richard's eyes widened with a desperate glimmer of hope. He nodded aggressively, telling me he would agree to absolutely anything. He said he would sign over company shares or give me a seat on his board of directors. He was completely willing to sell his soul to keep his superficial lifestyle intact. I shook my head slowly. I told him I did not want his failing company, and I certainly did not want to sit in a room with his racist friends. I told him the price of his financial survival was his daughter. Richard froze, the color completely draining from his face once again. I laid out the absolute terms of the cold deal. I told him that within the next 24 hours, Sutton was going to sit down in front of a high-definition camera. She was going to record a new video and post it to every single social media platform she possessed. In that video, she was going to publicly confess that her previous claims were complete lies. She was going to admit to the entire world that she snorted cocaine in the bridal suite, that she married my son solely to exploit his supposed trust fund, and that she was the one who violently assaulted my 74-year-old wife in an unprovoked attack. But the public confession was only the first half of the ultimatum. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents my corporate lawyers had prepared that very morning. I dropped the heavy papers onto the desk with a loud thud. I told Richard that after Sutton posted the video, she was going to sign these exact papers. It was a comprehensive legal annulment and a total waiver of marital rights. The document stated that Sutton acknowledged the marriage was contracted under fraudulent pretenses. It stripped her of any legal right to claim spousal support, alimony, or any division of assets whatsoever. She would leave the marriage with exactly what she brought into it, which was absolutely nothing. I looked Richard up and down, observing the profound moral cowardice hiding behind his expensive suit. I told him that if Sutton executed the public confession and signed the annulment without a single modification, I would restructure his $15 million corporate debt into a manageable 10-year payment plan. He would keep his company and he would keep his precious mansion. But if she refused, or if he tried to negotiate a single comma on those legal papers, I would press the button and wipe his entire bloodline off the financial map before the sun went down. The choice was incredibly simple, but devastatingly cruel. Richard had to choose between his own financial survival and his daughter's public destruction. If he forced her to confess, Sutton would face severe legal consequences and total social exile. Her reputation would be permanently ruined. But if he protected her, he would lose his wealth, his status, and his home. I watched the internal battle play out across his sweating face. It lasted exactly 10 seconds. Old money greed is a cancer that destroys loyalty. Richard did not argue. He did not try to defend his daughter or protect her future. He simply reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the thick stack of annulment papers toward his chest. He looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes and promised me that the video would be posted by noon and the signed papers would be delivered to my lawyer by the end of the day. He turned around and practically ran out of my office, holding the legal documents like a lifeline. I watched him stumble into the elevator, a broken and pathetic man who was rushing off to turn his own family camp into a war zone. He was going to walk into that cheap motel room and force his spoiled daughter to swallow her own poison. The enemy was no longer fighting me. They were now fighting each other for scraps of survival. I sat down in my high-backed leather chair and took a deep breath. The corporate execution had been carried out flawlessly. I packed up my briefcase and told my assistant to cancel my afternoon meetings. I wanted to go home to my wife. I wanted to sit in my quiet garden and drink iced tea, knowing that the cancer had been completely cut out of our lives. My driver took me back to the secure gated estate in Buckhead. The afternoon was warm and peaceful. Josephine was sitting on the back patio reading a book. Her cheek was still bandaged, but the stress had completely faded from her beautiful face. We sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the birds and watching the sun slowly begin to set. We thought the worst of the storm had passed. We thought the legal mechanisms I had set in motion were simply running their natural course. But just as the sky began to turn a deep shade of orange, the heavy iron gates at the front of our estate buzzed loudly. My head of security rushed out to the patio, his face tight with concern. He informed me that law enforcement had just arrived at the perimeter. I stood up, adjusting my suit jacket. I assumed Richard had done something incredibly foolish, like calling the police to report a financial crime or trying to claim extortion. I walked calmly through the massive house to the front entrance, expecting to quickly dismiss a confused patrol officer. I pulled the heavy mahogany front door open. Standing on my front porch were two serious-looking police detectives wearing plain clothes and carrying official leather badges on their belts. Their unmarked vehicle was idling in my circular driveway. I looked at the lead detective and asked him how I could help the Atlanta Police Department this evening. The detective did not smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of official court paper. He looked me right in the eye and stated that he was serving an active felony arrest warrant. My heart beat a fraction faster, but I kept my face perfectly still. I asked him what the charges were. The detective read from the paper stating the charges were felony elder abuse and filing a false police report. But as he unfolded the document and held it out for me to see, I realized the absolute brilliance of what was happening. The warrant was not for me, and it was not for my son. The police had come to my house looking for the bride. The evening air was cooling down, but the tension on my doorstep was thick and heavy. I looked at the lead detective standing on my front porch. He was a tall man with graying hair and a tired expression. His partner was younger and held a small leather notebook. The lead detective told me that he was not there to arrest me, but he had a legal obligation to investigate a very serious formal complaint that had just been filed. He explained that my daughter-in-law Sutton had walked into a police precinct just 3 hours ago. She had sworn under oath and filed a formal police report claiming that I had hired armed thugs to intimidate her and her family. Sutton was truly a fascinating creature of pure delusion. She had realized that her viral social media video was not enough to force my hand. She realized that her father was failing and that she was legally tied to a penniless man. So she decided to double down on her victimhood. She reached into the oldest and most venomous playbook in American history. She decided to weaponize the police against a wealthy black man. She thought her tears and her fragile white aesthetic would automatically make her the victim in the eyes of the law. She thought the police would break down my doors, drag me out in handcuffs, and force me to settle her massive lawsuit just to avoid a criminal trial. I did not act offended. I did not raise my voice or accuse the detectives of racism. When you know you hold the absolute truth in your hands, you do not need to be defensive. I simply stepped back and opened my heavy mahogany front door wider. I invited the detectives to step inside my home. I told them that the evening chill was setting in and that it was much better to discuss these serious allegations over a fresh cup of coffee. The younger detective looked surprised by my calm demeanor, but the older detective simply nodded and stepped over the threshold. I led them through the grand foyer of my estate. Their heavy boots echoed softly against the polished marble floors. I guided them into my private study, a large room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and filled with the scent of old paper and expensive leather. I asked them to take a seat on the comfortable leather sofa opposite my massive desk. I walked over to a small silver serving tray sitting on a side table. I poured 3 cups of dark roasted coffee from a thermal carafe. I handed a cup to each detective and sat down in my high-backed chair. I took a slow sip of my coffee and asked them to tell me exactly what my daughter-in-law had claimed. The older detective pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. It was a copy of her sworn affidavit. He read it aloud. Sutton claimed that shortly after being forced out of the country club, she and Andre had returned to their cheap motel. She alleged that 2 large, unidentified men had banged aggressively on their motel door claiming to work for me. She stated that these men possessed firearms and had threatened to cause her severe bodily harm if she did not immediately drop her $10 million lawsuit. Furthermore, she doubled down on her original lie. She swore under penalty of perjury that Josephine had brutally attacked her in the bridal suite and that the incident in the ballroom was merely her trying to defend herself from a violent elderly woman. It was a brilliantly constructed lie designed to trigger an immediate and aggressive police response. She painted me as a mob boss and her as an innocent hostage. The younger detective watched my face closely, waiting for a reaction. He was waiting for me to panic or to aggressively deny the charges. I placed my coffee cup down on the wooden coaster resting on my desk. I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine sigh. I told the detectives that it is a profound tragedy when the legal system is manipulated by a desperate person trying to hide their own criminal behavior. I opened the top drawer of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. I placed it gently on the center of the dark wood surface. I looked at the lead detective and explained that my real estate empire is built on absolute security. I told him that I do not simply rent out luxury venues. I own them entirely. And because I host events for some of the most powerful corporate entities in the world, every single square inch of my properties is equipped with state-of-the-art military-grade surveillance technology. I explained that the cameras do not just record high-definition video, but they also capture crystal-clear enhanced audio. I picked up the remote control from my desk and pointed it at the wall opposite the leather sofa. A massive flat-screen monitor seamlessly descended from a hidden panel in the ceiling. I stood up, picked up the silver USB drive, and walked over to the media console. I plugged the drive into the port and selected the primary video file. I turned back to the detectives and told them that I did not hire any thugs to visit Sutton at her motel. I explained that I had absolutely no reason to intimidate her because I already possessed everything necessary to send her to prison. I pressed play on the remote control. The massive screen flickered to life, displaying the raw 4K resolution footage from the luxury bridal suite. The quality was so pristine it looked like a high-budget cinema production. The detectives sat forward in their seats, their coffee cups completely forgotten. The video clearly showed Sutton sitting at the expensive vanity mirror surrounded by her bridesmaids. The enhanced audio picked up every single word. The detectives heard Sutton snorting cocaine through a rolled-up $100 bill. They heard her boastful, malicious laughter. They heard her explicitly detail her fraudulent plan to marry Andre solely to divorce him a year later and steal half of his supposed $50 million trust fund. The older detective frowned, pulling out a pen and beginning to take rapid notes. But the video was not over. The footage showed the exact moment my wife Josephine opened the door and walked into the suite. The cameras captured the quiet dignity of my wife as she placed the velvet jewelry box on the table. The audio captured her firm but polite request for Sutton to leave the estate immediately to avoid a public scandal over her drug use. The footage clearly showed that Josephine never raised her hand, never raised her voice, and never made a single threatening gesture. It showed Sutton panicking, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred as she realized her massive payday was evaporating. I paused the video and looked at the detectives. I told them that the bridal suite was just the prologue. I switched to the second file, which contained the synchronized feeds from the grand ballroom. The screen split into 4 different camera angles, providing a complete and undeniable view of the entire wedding reception. The video showed Josephine standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor holding a glass of cider. Then it showed Sutton marching aggressively across the marble floor, pushing past her own guests with violent intent. The detectives watched in absolute silence as the high-definition camera zoomed in on the confrontation. There was no ambiguity. There was no blurry movement or obstructed view. The video clearly captured Sutton raising her hand and delivering a brutal, unprovoked slap directly to my wife's face. The audio caught the sharp, sickening crack of skin hitting skin, followed by the sound of Josephine's expensive glasses shattering against the floor. The microphone suspended above the chandelier perfectly captured Sutton screaming her venomous command to "Get out of here, old woman." But the most damning piece of evidence came just a few seconds later. As I was kneeling on the floor wiping the blood from my wife's cheek, the camera captured Sutton turning to her mother Evelyn at the VIP table. The enhanced audio isolated Sutton's voice over the panicked murmurs of the crowd. The detectives clearly heard Sutton whisper to her mother that she was going to call the police and claim the old bitch attacked her first, so they could sue me for millions. It was premeditated, malicious, and entirely undeniable. I pressed the stop button on the remote control. The massive screen went completely black. The sudden silence in my study was heavy and absolute. I walked back to my desk and sat down in my leather chair. I picked up my coffee cup and took another slow sip. I looked at the 2 men sitting on my sofa. They were seasoned law enforcement officers who had likely seen every type of liar and manipulator the city of Atlanta had to offer. But they were visibly stunned by the sheer brazen audacity of the young white woman who had just sat in their precinct and lied to their faces. The older detective closed his leather notebook and let out a long, slow breath. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the black screen. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a slam-dunk felony conviction wrapped in a neat digital package. In the state of Georgia, filing a false police report is a serious crime. Perjury is a crime. Possession of a Schedule I narcotic is a crime. And unprovoked battery against a 74-year-old woman is a severe felony that carries mandatory prison time. Sutton had tried to use the police department as her personal weapon to terrorize my family. She had sworn under oath that I was a violent criminal. But all she had actually done was dig her own grave and invite the police to push her right into it. She had handed me the exact tool I needed to destroy her completely and legally. The lead detective stood up from the leather sofa. His demeanor had completely shifted. The subtle tension and suspicion he had carried into my home were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, professional determination. He looked at me and apologized for the intrusion. He formally requested to take the silver USB drive as official state evidence. I nodded and told him that he was more than welcome to keep it. The younger detective stood up beside his partner. He looked almost embarrassed that they had even entertained Sutton's ridiculous story. The lead detective reached down to his belt and pulled out his black police radio. He pressed the transmit button and called directly into his precinct dispatch. His voice was loud and clear, echoing off the mahogany walls of my quiet study. He informed dispatch that the intimidation complaint filed by Sutton was entirely fabricated. He formally requested that the investigation into my family be closed immediately. But he did not stop there. He instructed dispatch to locate a judge right now to sign an emergency arrest warrant. The target of their investigation had just drastically changed, and the hunters were now heading straight for the motel. The wheels of justice move incredibly slow for the poor, but they move with terrifying speed when a billionaire provides high-definition evidence of a felony. Just 20 minutes after the detectives walked out of my quiet study, an emergency arrest warrant was signed by a district court judge. The hunters were dispatched immediately. But Sutton was not hiding in her cheap motel room. She was entirely incapable of laying low. Her extreme narcissism required a constant audience to validate her delusions. She had taken a ride-share back to the Piedmont Elite Country Club, the very same place where her bankrupt father had threatened my son just a day earlier. It was the absolute peak of the lunch hour. The private outdoor dining terrace was packed to capacity, with wealthy socialites drinking expensive champagne and picking at tiny portions of gourmet food. Sutton was sitting at a premium shaded table surrounded by her high society friends. She was holding court. She was playing the role of the traumatized bride to absolute perfection. She wiped fake tears from her eyes as she recounted the horrific lies she had sworn to in her formal police report. She told her friends that my wife was a violent monster who had attacked her out of pure jealousy. She told them that I was a dangerous mafia boss who had sent armed thugs to terrorize her in the middle of the night. Her friends gasped and patted her hand, offering their empty sympathies and validating her racist delusions. Sutton was basking in the golden glow of their attention. She truly believed that at that very moment police officers were kicking down the heavy doors of my estate to drag me away in handcuffs. She took a slow sip of her mimosa, feeling completely untouchable and entirely superior to my family. She did not notice the heavy silence that suddenly began spreading across the dining terrace. The quiet clinking of expensive silverware and the soft hum of classical music abruptly stopped. Two plainclothes police detectives walked right through the grand mahogany doors of the clubhouse and stepped out onto the sunlit terrace. They did not stop at the host stand to check in. They did not ask for permission to enter the private club. They walked with the heavy, undeniable authority of the law. The wealthy patrons stared in absolute shock. The presence of law enforcement in their exclusive sanctuary was an incredibly rare and highly offensive sight. The older detective scanned the tables until his sharp eyes locked onto Sutton. He and his partner walked directly toward her table, their heavy boots thudding loudly against the polished stone floor. Sutton finally noticed them approaching. A massive, triumphant smile spread across her perfectly made-up face. She put down her crystal glass and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer dress. She looked at her friends with the incredibly smug expression, assuming the detectives had come to personally deliver the good news of my arrest to her table. She extended her hand, playing the role of the gracious, grateful victim. She thanked the officers for coming so quickly and asked them if the dangerous old man was finally in custody. The older detective did not take her hand. He did not smile. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from her and looked her right in the eye with absolute disgust. He asked her to confirm her full legal name. Sutton frowned, slightly confused by his cold professional tone, but she proudly stated her name, expecting to be treated like royalty. The detective nodded slowly. He reached down and unclipped the heavy, solid metal handcuffs from his leather belt. The loud metallic clack echoed across the completely silent dining terrace. The detective did not lower his voice to spare her fragile feelings. He spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single wealthy aristocrat on that terrace heard exactly what he had to say. He told Sutton that she was under arrest. He listed the charges one by one, letting the heavy words hang in the warm air. Felony elder abuse, filing a false police report, perjury, possession of a Schedule I narcotic. The smug, triumphant smile completely vanished from Sutton's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her wealthy friends gasped and pushed their heavy chairs back, physically distancing themselves from her as if she had a contagious disease. Sutton began to stammer rapidly, shaking her head and waving her manicured hands. She told the detectives there was a terrible mistake. She reminded them of her sworn statement claiming she was the real victim in this nightmare. The younger detective stepped forward and grabbed her left wrist tightly. He told her there was no mistake and that they had already watched the high-definition 4K security footage from the bridal suite and the grand ballroom. That single sentence broke her completely. She realized the raw, unedited truth was now in the hands of the police, and her elaborate web of lies had entirely collapsed. The elegant, sophisticated Southern belle completely evaporated into thin air. Sutton began to scream. It was not a delicate cry for help. It was the harsh, ugly shriek of a cornered rat realizing the steel trap had finally snapped shut over its neck. She tried to pull her arm away, but the detective easily overpowered her. He twisted her arms roughly behind her back and locked the cold steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The older detective began reading her Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice. "You have the right to remain silent." But Sutton was entirely incapable of remaining silent. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the stone floor. She screamed for her father to save her. She screamed for her friends to do something, to call their expensive lawyers to stop this absolute madness. But her friends just sat there staring at her in absolute shock and disgust. Nobody wanted to be associated with a hysterical woman who assaulted the elderly, snorted cocaine, and lied to the police. The detectives did not show an ounce of pity for her wealthy background. They grabbed her firmly by the arms and forcefully marched her through the exact center of the dining terrace. It was the ultimate public humiliation designed to strip away her fake prestige. The wealthy elite of Atlanta watched in absolute silence as the supposed Princess of Charleston was paraded through the country club looking like a feral animal. Her expensive designer dress was twisted, her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess, and black mascara was running heavily down her cheeks. She kicked and sobbed, begging the officers to let her go, claiming she was from a good family and did not belong in a dirty jail cell. They ignored her desperate pleas. They pushed her through the mahogany doors, dragging her out of the luxurious clubhouse and into the bright, harsh sunlight of the front parking lot. Andre was standing in the parking lot, having just arrived in another cheap rideshare vehicle. He had come to the club to beg Sutton for forgiveness, to try and somehow salvage his broken, pathetic marriage. He thought he could apologize and fix things. But as he stepped out of the battered sedan, he froze completely. He watched the heavy glass doors of the clubhouse burst open. He watched two large detectives drag his screaming wife out into the parking lot. He listened to her swearing and thrashing, sounding absolutely deranged. The pristine, flawless image of the aristocratic white woman he had blindly idolized completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. He finally saw her for exactly what she was. She was a vicious, manipulative criminal who had thrown away everything for her own toxic greed. He stood paralyzed behind a parked car, watching as the detectives shoved her forcefully into the back of an unmarked police cruiser. They slammed the heavy door shut, cutting off her hysterical screams. The cruiser sped out of the country club parking lot, leaving a heavy cloud of dust floating in the air. Andre stood entirely alone in the quiet parking lot, his heart pounding violently against his ribs. His entire world had been completely dismantled in less than 24 hours. He slowly walked toward the entrance of the clubhouse, not knowing what to do or where to go next. As he approached the wide stone steps, one of Sutton's wealthy friends walked out the door looking deeply uncomfortable. The woman was holding Sutton's expensive leather designer purse, which had been left behind on the dining chair during the chaotic, violent arrest. The woman shoved the purse hard into Andre's chest without saying a single word and quickly walked away, avoiding his gaze entirely. Andre stood there holding the heavy leather bag. He looked down at it, feeling completely hollow and defeated. The purse was completely unzipped. Sitting right on top of her expensive makeup was Sutton's smartphone. The screen suddenly lit up with an incoming message notification. Because she had been actively texting her friends when the police arrived, the phone had not locked. It was completely open and vulnerable. Andre stared at the glowing screen. The message on the display was from a man he did not recognize. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into the purse and pulled the unlocked device out into the bright sunlight. Andre stood completely alone in the sweltering heat of the country club parking lot, holding the heavy designer purse. The luxurious world he thought he belonged to was moving on without him. Wealthy patrons were walking to their expensive cars, completely ignoring the broken man standing on the asphalt. He looked down at the glowing screen of Sutton's unlocked smartphone. His hands were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device. He needed to get away from the staring eyes of the valet drivers and the whispering country club staff. Having absolutely no money for another rideshare, he swallowed the last tiny fraction of his pride and dialed a number he had not called in over 2 years. He called Marcus, an old college roommate. Marcus was a man Andre had completely cut out of his life because Sutton had deemed him too working class and too black to fit into their carefully curated high society aesthetic. 20 agonizing minutes later, a beat-up silver Honda pulled into the pristine circular driveway of the club. Its engine sputtered loudly and the front bumper was heavily dented. It was a massive eyesore against the backdrop of imported luxury vehicles. Andre opened the passenger door and collapsed into the worn fabric seat. Marcus did not ask any questions. He took one look at Andre's ruined tailored suit and the hollow, devastated expression on his face, and simply put the car in drive. As they pulled out of the elite neighborhood and headed toward the busy downtown connector, Andre looked down at the phone in his hands. The device was still completely unlocked. The notification that had caught his eye was a message from an unsaved number. Andre opened the messaging application and his eyes immediately locked onto a long thread of conversations. There was no name attached to the contact, but there was a profile picture. It was a handsome, wealthy-looking white man holding a glass of whiskey on a yacht. Andre recognized him instantly. It was Spencer, one of the groomsmen from the wedding. Spencer was a man who came from the same bankrupt aristocratic circle as Sutton's family. He was the man Sutton had always claimed was just a close childhood friend. Andre clicked on the conversation thread. He started to read the messages. The words glowing on the bright digital screen were sharp and incredibly violent. They cut through the thick, suffocating air of the hot car like a razor blade. Andre scrolled up reading messages that had been sent just hours before the wedding ceremony. He read messages that had been sent during their supposed romantic dinners over the past 6 months. He read every single toxic secret his new wife had been hiding behind her flawless smile. Sutton did not love him. She had never loved him for a single second. Her messages to Spencer were filled with absolute pure disgust for Andre and for my entire family. She referred to Andre as a pathetic, obedient dog. She typed that she could barely stand to let him touch her, but she had to play the part to secure the bag. She laughed in her messages about how incredibly naive Andre was, how he believed every single lie she told him simply because she had blonde hair and a prestigious last name. She mocked the way he dressed, the way he spoke, and the desperate way he craved the approval of her racist parents. But the insults were not even the most devastating part of the digital archive. As Andre scrolled further back, he discovered the exact blueprint of her malicious financial conspiracy. Sutton and Spencer had planned the entire marriage together. Spencer had recommended a shady corporate lawyer who specialized in exploiting wealthy trust funds. Sutton explained the plan in explicit detail across dozens of text messages. She wrote that she only needed to endure being married to the stupid black heir for exactly 6 months. She detailed how she would use the prenuptial agreement loophole and the state community property laws to trigger a massive divorce settlement. She bragged to her lover that she was going to walk away with $25 million in tax-free cash. She promised Spencer that as soon as the ink was dry on the divorce papers, she would buy them a villa in the south of France and they would never have to work a single day in their lives. She even sent Spencer a picture of herself trying on her custom wedding dress with a caption that read, "Putting on my work uniform to go rob the bank." Sitting in the passenger seat of that beat-up Honda, my son finally experienced a total psychological collapse. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. His chest heaved as if he were suffocating. The reality of his absolute stupidity crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing building. He stared out the window at the passing city streets, but he could not see anything through the heavy tears that finally began to fall from his eyes. He realized in that agonizing moment that everything he had thrown away was for an absolute mirage. A reel of devastating memories began to play rapidly in his mind. He remembered the exact moment in the grand ballroom when Sutton raised her hand and struck his mother. He remembered looking down at his expensive shoes while Josephine bled on the marble floor. He had chosen to protect his wife because he believed she represented his golden ticket to high society acceptance. He had traded the unconditional love of the parents who built a massive empire for him, all for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a naive, disposable payday. He remembered the countless times I had tried to warn him. He remembered the nights I sat him down in my study trying to teach him about the ruthless nature of the real estate business and the dangerous people who only pretend to be your friend when you have money. I had spent 28 years trying to build a fortress around him to protect him from the very predators he had eagerly invited into our home. And he had repaid my lifelong dedication by publicly humiliating us by defending a violent racist, and by spitting on the legacy I poured my blood and sweat into creating. The crushing guilt and profound shame were almost too much for his physical body to handle. He dropped the smartphone onto the floorboard of the car, unable to look at the hateful words for another second. He bent over, burying his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the small enclosed space of the vehicle. His friend Marcus kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly, giving Andre the silent space to completely fall apart. There was no comfort to be offered. There was no silver lining. Andre was a man who had burned down his own castle just to please a woman who was holding the match. He had lost his $50 million trust fund. He had lost his luxury penthouse. He had lost his corporate credit cards and his prestigious status in the local elite social circles. But none of those financial losses compared to the true tragedy of his situation. He had lost his father and his mother. He had permanently severed the only genuine bond of love and protection he had ever known. He was completely alone in the world, a penniless man chained to a disgraced criminal who was currently sitting in a jail cell. As Andre wept in the passenger seat, the heavy, suffocating humidity of the Atlanta afternoon finally broke. The sky above the city began to darken rapidly. Massive charcoal gray clouds rolled in, blocking out the warm sunshine and casting a dark, ominous shadow over the entire skyline. The temperature dropped significantly in a matter of minutes. A sudden violent gust of wind shook the small car, rattling the windows and blowing debris across the highway. Then the rain began to fall. It was not a gentle southern shower. It was a massive torrential thunderstorm. The heavy raindrops hit the metal roof of the Honda, sounding like thousands of tiny hammers. A brilliant flash of lightning tore across the dark sky, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. The storm was a perfect reflection of the absolute chaos and destruction that had consumed his life over the past 24 hours. Andre slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red and swollen, his face wet with tears. He looked out the passenger window, watching the heavy rain wash down the glass, blurring the lights of the city. A desperate, irrational thought began to take root in his broken mind. He believed that if he could just see me face to face, if he could just explain the depth of Sutton's betrayal and show me the text messages on the phone, I would magically forgive him. He wanted to revert to being a little boy running back to his father to fix his massive mistakes. He completely forgot the cold, unforgiving look in my eyes when I walked out of the corporate boardroom. He forgot the absolute finality of the morality clause. He wiped his face with the back of his trembling hand and sat up straight in the seat. He turned to Marcus. His voice was hoarse and broken, barely audible over the sound of the pouring rain and the roaring engine of the old car. He told his friend to change directions. He told Marcus to get off the downtown connector and head north. He gave him the exact address of my private gated estate in Buckhead. Marcus looked at him with deep concern, warning him that showing up unannounced in the middle of a massive thunderstorm after everything that had happened was a terrible idea. But Andre refused to listen. He pleaded with his friend, telling him it was a matter of life and death. He needed to go home. He needed to stand in front of the man he had betrayed and beg for a salvation that no longer existed. The beat-up silver Honda took the next exit, its tires slipping slightly on the wet asphalt, and drove directly into the heart of the raging storm, heading straight for my iron gates. The torrential thunderstorm that had swallowed the city of Atlanta was showing no signs of stopping. The heavy, relentless rain battered the slate roof of my Buckhead estate, sounding like a continuous rolling drumbeat. Jagged forks of bright lightning flashed across the dark evening sky, violently illuminating the towering ancient oak trees that surrounded my massive property. At the end of my long, winding cobblestone driveway stood the heavy, wrought iron gates. They were a towering physical barrier specifically designed to separate my peaceful sanctuary from the chaotic and demanding world outside. I was sitting in my dimly lit study, listening to the violent storm rattle the thick glass windows, when the primary security monitor on my massive mahogany desk suddenly flared to life. The hidden motion sensors at the front gate had been triggered by an approaching vehicle. I leaned forward in my high-backed leather chair and looked closely at the high-definition screen. I watched a battered silver sedan slowly pull up and stop just inches away from the heavy black iron bars. The passenger door opened and a figure stepped out into the freezing, blinding downpour. It was Andre. He did not have an umbrella or a heavy coat to protect himself from the elements. He was wearing the exact same ruined designer suit he had worn to the country club earlier that afternoon. The heavy rain instantly soaked through the expensive thin fabric, pressing it flat against his shivering skin and ruining his expensive leather shoes in the deep puddles forming on the asphalt. He walked unsteadily toward the towering iron gates, gripping the wet, slick metal bars with both of his bare hands. He slowly tilted his head back and looked directly up at the primary security camera mounted high on the stone pillar. The small red light on the camera housing indicated that it was actively recording and broadcasting a live feed directly into my quiet study. Andre knew I was sitting at my desk. He knew I was watching his every move. He pressed his wet face against the cold iron bars and began to speak. The highly sensitive external microphones picked up the sound of his voice, cutting clearly through the heavy white noise of the falling rain and the distant rumble of thunder. He started by calling me Dad, a deeply personal word he had barely used with any real genuine affection in several years. His voice was trembling violently, breaking under the immense weight of his total despair. He told the camera that he had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake. He said he finally saw the absolute truth about the woman he had blindly married. He confessed to the camera that he had found her unlocked smartphone in her abandoned purse and read all the horrific toxic text messages she had sent to her secret lover. He cried out that she had meticulously planned to rob our family from the very beginning and that she had never loved him for a single second. The heavy tears streaming down his face mixed completely with the freezing rain, washing away the last remnants of his arrogant pride. He dropped heavily to his knees on the wet, rough asphalt, but he kept his hands locked tightly around the thick iron bars, refusing to let go. He began to beg for forgiveness, pleading with me to press the button to open the gates and let him inside the warm, secure house. He desperately wanted to come inside and be comforted like a frightened child. He wanted me to magically fix the massive financial and social disaster he had foolishly brought upon himself. He screamed loudly into the raging storm, claiming that he was totally brainwashed by Sutton and her racist, bankrupt family. He claimed they had masterfully manipulated him and made him feel deeply insecure about his own background, so he desperately tried to blindly please them to gain their elite social acceptance. He sobbed loudly, telling the unblinking camera that he was so incredibly sorry for what had happened in the grand ballroom. He swore on his life that he was simply paralyzed by sudden shock and did not know what to do when his wife violently slapped his mother. He begged for a second chance, promising over and over that he would sign the annulment papers immediately and do whatever grueling work it took to eventually earn back my respect. He sounded exactly like a terrified little boy who had accidentally broken a window and was terrified of his father's discipline. But he was not a little boy making an innocent mistake. He was a 28-year-old grown man who had made a conscious active choice to stand in complete silence and watch his mother bleed onto a marble floor. I sat in my quiet study, completely motionless, watching my only son fall entirely apart on the glowing digital screen. The quiet, comforting warmth of my room was an incredibly harsh contrast to the freezing, violent storm raging just beyond my walls. The dark mahogany bookshelves and the soft golden light of the desk lamp felt like an impenetrable fortress. I did not feel a sudden, overwhelming surge of paternal sympathy. I did not feel the natural parental urge to run out into the freezing rain and wrap a heavy, warm coat around his shivering, shaking shoulders. That specific version of me, the loving father who had constantly shielded his son from the cold, harsh realities of the world and paid for all his mistakes, had completely died the moment the wedding reception was locked down. The man sitting in the leather chair right now was simply the ruthless architect of an empire protecting his secure borders from a known liability. As I watched Andre sob uncontrollably into the camera, the heavy wooden door of my study softly clicked open. Josephine walked quietly into the room. She was wearing a thick, elegant cashmere sweater and holding a warm, steaming cup of herbal tea. The crisp white medical bandage on her right cheek was a bright, stark contrast against her beautiful, flawless dark skin. She walked slowly over to my desk and looked down at the bright security monitor. She saw the son she had carried in her own womb kneeling in the wet dirt, begging the camera for a salvation that simply no longer existed. I looked up at her calm face, fully expecting to see tears or a brief moment of maternal weakness. But Josephine was incredibly, remarkably strong. The deep, agonizing pain of the betrayal had already scarred over within her, hardening into a profound sense of permanent closure. She carefully set her porcelain teacup down on the wooden coaster and stepped closely behind my chair. She placed her warm, steady hands on my shoulders, giving them a gentle, reassuring squeeze of total solidarity. She did not ask me to press the button to open the heavy gates. She did not ask me to go out into the storm and forgive him for his cowardly sins. She simply looked at the digital screen with a quiet, sorrowful acceptance of reality. We both inherently knew that letting him back into the family estate would not be an act of genuine love. It would be a foolish act of enabling weakness that would only teach him that his horrible cowardice had no real lasting consequences. Some bridges simply cannot be carefully rebuilt once they have been intentionally burned down to ashes. I reached out and placed my large hand directly over Josephine's, holding her fingers tightly against my shoulder. I looked back at the glowing monitor. Andre was still violently crying, his wet forehead resting heavily against the cold iron bars. The storm outside was growing even more intense, the wind howling loudly through the ancient trees and shaking the camera housing. It was finally time to give him his absolute final answer. It was time to completely and permanently sever the financial and emotional tether so he could finally learn how to survive and stand on his own 2 feet in the real world. I leaned forward slightly and pressed my index finger firmly against the heavy silver intercom button located on my desk console. A soft, sharp electronic chime immediately echoed from the powerful external speakers mounted on the stone pillars out in the rain. Andre heard the chime and instantly stopped crying. He jerked his wet head up, looking directly into the glowing camera lens with wide, desperate eyes. He held his breath, completely ignoring the freezing rain, waiting eagerly for me to tell him that the gates were finally opening. He desperately waited for the heavy iron to swing inward and welcome him back into his luxurious, unearned life of extreme privilege. I spoke directly and clearly into the sensitive desk microphone. My deep voice was incredibly calm, perfectly smooth, and entirely devoid of any lingering anger or underlying hatred. The powerful external speakers amplified my steady words, projecting them clearly and dominantly over the deafening, chaotic sound of the raging thunderstorm. I told him that an apology entirely driven by the sudden loss of a massive trust fund is not a real apology at all. I told him that realizing his beautiful wife was a manipulative criminal only after she lost her own wealth did not suddenly make him an innocent victim. It only made him a pathetic, useful fool. He opened his mouth to quickly argue, to desperately beg me just one more time to listen to his excuses, but I absolutely did not give him the chance to speak. I delivered the absolute final verdict with the cold, heavy precision of a Supreme Court judge handing down an inescapable life sentence. I said a man who watches his mother bleed is no son of mine. Walk away. I lifted my finger and released the heavy silver button, instantly cutting off the microphone connection and plunging the intercom back into silence. Andre stared at the camera lens, his bloodshot eyes wide with absolute pure horror. He fully realized in that exact terrifying second that my cold decision was final, absolute, and completely irreversible. There would be absolutely no second chances given tonight or ever again. There would be no warm, dry blankets or hot meals waiting for him inside the safety of the mansion. He was completely, formally, and permanently exiled from the family empire. I reached out and firmly flipped the heavy metal toggle switch on the security console. The power to the external front gate camera was instantly completely severed. The live video feed on my desk monitor flickered once and went completely pitch black. The digital connection between us was permanently erased, leaving nothing but a dark screen. The glowing blank monitor reflected only the quiet, peaceful interior of my warm study. Josephine leaned down and softly kissed the top of my head, a beautiful silent gesture of unbreakable solidarity and absolute marital unity. I turned the monitor power off completely, plunging that section of the desk into a soft, peaceful shadow. Outside the heavy iron gates, the battered silver Honda remained idling in the pouring rain, waiting patiently to carry a broken, penniless man back to the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world he now had to navigate completely alone. Inside the warm, impenetrable fortress of my estate, the deeply personal, emotional chapter of this terrible tragedy was officially firmly closed forever. I gently let go of Josephine's warm hand and opened the deep bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk. I pulled out 3 incredibly thick binders entirely filled with corporate legal filings, banking records, and hostile takeover blueprints. The personal painful betrayal had been handled and the emotional rot had been completely amputated from our lives. But the massive corporate war was certainly not over yet. Richard was still desperately scrambling, trying to somehow save his failing logistics empire, and Sutton was currently sitting shivering in a cold concrete holding cell, waiting for her high-priced lawyers to try and build a pathetic defense. I opened the first heavy binder and picked up my expensive gold fountain pen. The time for quiet sorrow and family reflection was completely finished. It was time for the absolute corporate execution to resume. The massive, relentless legal machinery was officially starting up its heavy gears, entirely ready to grind my arrogant enemies into absolute fine dust. 48 hours is a very generous amount of time for a man who claims to be a powerful aristocrat to raise $15 million. I sat in my private office on the morning the deadline was set to expire. The sun was rising over the city of Atlanta, casting a bright golden light across my heavy oak desk. I had instructed my wealth management team to monitor the proxy hedge fund accounts with absolute precision. We watched the digital ledgers as the hours slowly ticked down. I knew Richard was spending every waking second running from bank to bank, begging his wealthy country club friends for emergency loans. I knew he was sitting in luxurious private lounges, sweating through his expensive suits, pleading with men who used to respect him. But high society is a ruthless ecosystem. The moment the scent of blood hits the water, the other sharks do not offer you a life raft. They simply circle you and wait for you to drown. Richard was learning that his prestigious last name and his pale skin could not magically generate cash when his actual corporate value was absolutely zero. His friends smiled politely and offered him their deepest sympathies, but they kept their checkbooks completely closed. At exactly noon, the deadline officially expired. The digital ledger on my secure monitor remained completely blank. Not a single dollar had been transferred. The silence in my office was incredibly peaceful. It was the quiet sound of a trap snapping entirely shut. I did not pick up the phone to call him. I did not ask my assistant to send a friendly reminder. I simply authorized my lead corporate lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, to initiate the immediate hostile takeover. The legal machinery I had built over 40 years of cutthroat real estate deals roared to life with terrifying efficiency. Within 60 minutes, a fleet of black corporate vehicles pulled up to the front entrance of Richard's failing logistics headquarters in Charleston. Mr. Caldwell walked through the glass doors flanked by 4 heavily armed private security contractors and 2 forensic accountants. They did not wait in the lobby. They marched directly into the executive boardroom where Richard was sitting with his head buried in his hands. Caldwell placed the formal foreclosure documents directly on the table. The papers legally transferred total ownership of the company, the commercial fleet, and the massive supply warehouses directly to my proxy holding firm. The forensic accountants immediately moved to the server room to freeze all digital operations while the security team secured the physical assets. Richard did not even try to fight. He was completely broken. The security contractors stood behind his chair and politely asked him to empty his pockets. They confiscated his corporate phone, his company credit cards, and the keys to his luxury executive vehicle. Then they escorted the man who had called my son a street rat right out the front door of his own building. He was forced to walk past hundreds of his own employees carrying a single cardboard box filled with cheap office supplies. The dispatchers and the warehouse workers watched in stunned silence as the arrogant owner was paraded out like a common thief. He had to call a cheap local taxi to take him home because he no longer owned the car he drove to work. The absolute humiliation was profound and thoroughly deserved, but taking his failing business was only the first necessary step of the execution. The logistics company was merely the engine that funded his arrogance. The true source of his incredibly toxic pride was the massive ancestral mansion located in the most exclusive historical district of Charleston. It was a sprawling colonial estate with towering white pillars, ancient oak trees, and a dark history built entirely on the suffering of my ancestors. Richard and Evelyn used that house as a physical monument to their supposed genetic superiority. They hosted lavish parties in the grand gardens, looking down on anyone who did not possess their specific pedigree. They firmly believed that the house made them untouchable. They were entirely wrong. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the local county sheriff arrived at the wrought iron gates of the Charleston estate holding a court-ordered eviction notice. The mortgage default was absolute and the property was now legally registered under my name. The sheriff knocked heavily on the grand wooden door. Evelyn answered, wearing her signature pearl necklace and a silk robe, holding a glass of expensive wine. When the sheriff handed her the official eviction papers and told her she had exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises, she completely collapsed onto the porch, dropping her glass. It shattered across the pristine stones, just like the glasses Sutton had broken on my wife's face. Richard arrived in his cheap taxi just in time to see his hysterical wife being told to pack her bags by armed law enforcement. They were forced to stuff their expensive clothes into black plastic trash bags and cheap suitcases, crying openly on the pristine front lawn. Their wealthy neighbors stood on their own massive porches, watching in absolute horrified silence. Nobody came over to help them carry their bags. The old money aristocrats were officially homeless, standing on the sidewalk waiting for another taxi. I had absolutely no intention of keeping that cursed house. I did not want to sleep in the same rooms where generations of arrogant racists had lived. I did not want to sell the property to another wealthy white family who would simply continue the toxic cycle of historical exclusion. I wanted to completely eradicate the legacy of Richard's family from the face of the earth. I wanted his name to be permanently erased from the high society history books he loved so much. I instructed my legal team to immediately draft a deed of total transfer. Before the sun even went down that evening, the majestic Charleston estate was officially donated to a massive nonprofit organization based in Atlanta. The organization specialized in providing housing education and intense professional mentorship to at-risk Black youth from the inner city. I funded a massive permanent endowment to completely renovate the colonial mansion and turn it into a sprawling state-of-the-art community center. The grand ballroom where Evelyn used to host her exclusive elitist parties was going to be transformed into a modern computer laboratory for young Black teenagers. The pristine, manicured gardens where Richard smoked his expensive cigars were going to be converted into an agricultural learning center and a community greenhouse. The towering white pillars of the estate would no longer represent old money oppression and inherited racism. They would represent the absolute triumph of the people Richard and his family had always desperately tried to keep at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The historical plaque by the front gate bearing his family name was ordered to be immediately removed and destroyed. When the local news outlets published the massive story about the charitable donation the following morning, the humiliation for Richard's family became absolute and permanent. It was the ultimate psychological destruction. He had lost his daughter to the criminal justice system. He had lost his business to his own financial incompetence. And now the historic mansion his family had ruthlessly protected for over a century was going to be filled with the joyful laughter of the very same children he had always despised. He could not fight back. He had absolutely zero legal recourse and absolutely zero money to hire a defense attorney. He and his wife were forced to move into a tiny rented apartment on the miserable outskirts of the city, living entirely off the remaining scraps of Evelyn's depleted personal savings. They were completely exiled from the country club. Their wealthy friends officially stopped answering their phone calls, pretending they had never even met them. The social isolation was profound and absolutely suffocating. Richard had finally learned the most painful lesson of his entirely worthless life. He learned that true power does not come from the color of your skin or the history of your last name. True power comes from the absolute quiet ability to completely dismantle your enemies without ever having to raise your voice. The corporate execution was executed flawlessly, leaving absolutely no financial survivors in its wake. Every single threat he had made in the country club had been systematically reversed and forced down his own throat. He was a ghost haunting a city he used to rule. The financial war was officially over, and my massive real estate empire was more secure than ever before. I sat in my warm garden with Josephine, drinking iced tea and enjoying the profound peace that comes from total victory. We had successfully protected our legacy from the toxic parasites who tried to drain it. But the legal machinery of the state of Georgia was still slowly grinding forward. While Richard and Evelyn were busy learning how to survive in a tiny apartment, their daughter was experiencing a much darker reality. Sutton had spent the last several weeks sitting in a cold, damp concrete holding cell entirely stripped of her designer dresses and her expensive makeup. She had exhausted all her manipulative tears and realized that no white knight was coming to save her. I placed my glass of iced tea down on the patio table when my secure tablet chimed with a high-priority notification from the district attorney office. The grand jury had officially returned a massive multi-count felony indictment. The notification contained the formal schedule for the upcoming legal proceedings. It was the official subpoena requesting my wife to appear as the primary witness. The corporate bloodbath had completely concluded, but the criminal trial for the arrogant bride was just about to begin. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom number 4 in the Fulton County Courthouse swung open. It had been exactly 3 months since the disastrous wedding reception. The crisp autumn air outside was a sharp contrast to the stale, suffocating atmosphere of the criminal justice building. I walked into the courtroom with my beautiful wife Josephine holding her arm gently as we took our seats in the front row directly behind the prosecutor's table. I looked across the center aisle at the defense table. Sutton was sitting there, and the physical transformation was absolutely shocking. The arrogant, glowing bride who had demanded $50 million in a glass boardroom was completely gone. She looked incredibly pale and dangerously thin. She was not wearing custom silk or designer heels. Because her father was entirely bankrupt and she was legally cut off from my family wealth, she could not afford a private defense attorney. She was sitting next to an overworked public defender wearing a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that someone had likely purchased from a discount store just for the trial. Her blonde hair had lost its expensive shine, and her hands trembled constantly as she stared down at the scratched wooden table. The trial began, and it quickly became apparent how desperate her situation truly was. Her public defender stood up to deliver the opening statement. He was a tired man carrying a massive stack of manila folders, clearly overwhelmed by his caseload. He tried his absolute best to weave a narrative of sympathy for his client. He could not deny the assault because the video evidence was entirely public and undeniable. Instead, he attempted to argue a state of temporary insanity. He told the jury that Sutton was a fragile young woman suffering from severe psychological distress caused by the overwhelming pressure of planning a high-society wedding. He claimed she experienced a sudden, devastating mental break and lost complete control of her bodily functions. He actually tried to argue that the toxic environment of my wealthy family had pushed her over the edge and that she was not in her right mind when she struck my wife. It was a pathetic, insulting defense that completely stripped away whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. Sutton sat there listening to her own lawyer call her mentally unstable, and she could not do absolutely anything to stop him. The prosecutor, a sharp, incredibly focused woman, called Josephine to the witness stand. The entire courtroom fell absolutely silent as my wife stood up. Josephine was wearing a tailored navy blue suit with a single elegant pearl necklace. She walked to the witness box with the unbreakable grace of a queen stepping up to her throne. She did not look like a frail, elderly victim. She looked like a woman of immense power and absolute undeniable truth. She raised her right hand and swore the oath, her voice echoing clearly through the high-ceilinged room. The prosecutor began the direct examination, gently asking Josephine to describe the events of that evening. Josephine did not cry. She did not let her voice tremble or break. She did not perform for the jury like a cheap actor. She simply looked directly at the 12 men and women in the jury box and told them exactly what happened. She spoke about walking into the bridal suite to deliver a family heirloom. She spoke about finding Sutton snorting cocaine and listening to her brag about a fraudulent plan to steal my son's trust fund. Sutton shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her face turning a bright burning red, as her deepest, most toxic secrets were exposed in a public court of law. Then the prosecutor asked Josephine to describe the physical altercation in the grand ballroom. Josephine recounted the moment with devastating articulation. She explained how she approached Sutton quietly to ask her to leave the premises without causing a public scene. She described how Sutton turned around with absolute malicious intent and delivered a full-force blow to the side of her face. Josephine did not exaggerate the pain. She simply stated the medical facts. The prosecutor approached the bench and submitted the official medical records from Emory University Hospital into evidence. The documents were projected onto a large screen for the jury to read. The emergency room doctor had formally diagnosed Josephine with a severely ruptured right eardrum caused by the sheer blunt force of Sutton's heavy diamond engagement ring. The injury had resulted in a permanent 20% loss of hearing in that ear. The charge of felony elder abuse was no longer just about a simple slap on the cheek. It was now about permanent physical mutilation inflicted upon a senior citizen. The jury members looked at the medical documents and then looked over at Sutton with expressions of pure, absolute disgust. The ultimate weapon was still waiting to be deployed. The prosecutor asked the judge for permission to play the primary exhibit. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall flickered to life. I had provided the prosecution with the exact same 4K resolution security footage I had shown the detectives in my private study. The jury watched the pristine, unedited video of the assault. They watched Sutton's face twist into an ugly mask of hatred as she struck my wife. They heard the sickening crack of the impact through the high-quality courtroom speakers. And most importantly, they heard the enhanced audio of Sutton whispering to her mother immediately after the attack. They heard her explicitly state her premeditated plan to lie to the police to claim self-defense and to sue my family for millions of dollars. The temporary insanity defense her public defender had tried to build was instantly completely destroyed. You cannot claim a sudden mental break when you are simultaneously calculating a massive million-dollar lawsuit and whispering a fraudulent legal strategy to your mother. The video proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Sutton was completely lucid, entirely malicious, and absolutely guilty. The public defender stood up for the cross-examination, but he looked like a man walking to his own execution. He had absolutely nothing to work with. He tried to ask Josephine a few mild questions, attempting to rattle her composure or find a tiny inconsistency in her timeline. He asked if she had perhaps spoken to Sutton in a threatening tone before the strike occurred. Josephine looked at the tired lawyer with a calm, steady gaze. She replied that the truth does not require a threatening tone and that she merely asked a trespasser to leave her property. The lawyer swallowed hard, nodded his head, and sat back down without asking another single question. He knew that pressing an elegant, composed elderly woman who had just had her eardrum ruptured on camera would only make the jury hate his client even more. Before the closing arguments began, the judge called for a brief 15-minute recess. The courtroom slowly emptied out as people stretched their legs and walked into the hallway. I remained seated next to Josephine, holding her hand. I watched Sutton sit completely alone at the defense table. Her public defender had walked out to grab a cup of cheap coffee, leaving her entirely unsupervised. She slowly turned her head and looked back at the wooden benches designated for the public and the family members. The benches directly behind her were completely empty. She looked for her father, hoping he would walk through the doors with his expensive suit and his arrogant swagger to somehow fix this nightmare. She looked for her mother, hoping to see the comforting pearl necklace and the fake aristocratic smile. She even looked for Andre, the pathetic boy she had so viciously manipulated and destroyed. But nobody came for her. The chilling realization of her absolute, total isolation finally washed over her pale face. The old money prestige she had wielded like a heavy weapon her entire life had completely evaporated, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the terrifying reality of a cold prison sentence. She turned back around and stared at the empty judge's bench, a completely broken woman waiting for the final blow to fall. The trial moved incredibly fast. The prosecution rested their case and the defense had absolutely no witnesses to call. Richard and Evelyn did not even show up to the courthouse to support their daughter. They were too busy hiding in their tiny rented apartment, entirely ashamed of their public downfall. Andre was nowhere to be found, having vanished completely into the city after I locked him out of my estate. Sutton was entirely alone, abandoned by the very people she had tried to impress and enrich. The closing arguments were delivered right before the lunch recess. The prosecutor reminded the jury that wealth and social status do not grant anyone the right to commit violence against the elderly. She pointed directly at Sutton and called her a calculating predator who weaponized the legal system for her own toxic greed. The public defender merely asked the jury for mercy, a request that sounded incredibly hollow in the echoing courtroom. The judge gave the final instructions, and the bailiff escorted the 12 jurors out of the room to begin their formal deliberations. In complex felony cases involving massive amounts of evidence, a jury can sometimes take days or even weeks to reach a unanimous verdict. The lawyers usually pack up their briefcases and tell their clients to go home and wait for a phone call. I did not leave the courtroom. Josephine and I remained sitting in the front row, exactly where we had been all morning. Sutton sat at the defense table, staring blankly at the wall, her hands folded in her lap. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open just as the clock on the wall ticked past 45 minutes. The bailiff walked back in and handed a small, folded piece of paper to the judge. The jury had not even ordered lunch. They had not asked to review the security footage a second time. They had not asked for any clarification on the legal statutes. They had already reached a unanimous decision, and they were walking back into the courtroom in less than an hour. The heavy wooden clock on the courtroom wall ticked with a slow, agonizing rhythm. We had been waiting for exactly 45 minutes, but to the woman sitting at the defense table, it must have felt like an absolute eternity. Sutton was staring at the heavy double doors at the back of the room. Her hands gripped together so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She was vibrating with a nervous, desperate energy. She still possessed a tiny, microscopic shred of hope that her white privilege and her fragile appearance would somehow save her from the devastating consequences of her own horrific actions. She truly thought the jury might feel sorry for her. She thought the criminal justice system would give her a gentle slap on the wrist simply because she was a wealthy young woman from a historically prominent aristocratic family. She had absolutely no idea that her historical prominence had already been completely erased from the map. The heavy wooden doors finally swung open, and the armed bailiff led the 12 jurors back into the silent courtroom. The atmosphere instantly shifted from nervous waiting to suffocating heavy tension. I reached over and gently held Josephine's hand. Her skin was warm and completely steady. She did not look at the jury with fear or anxiety. She looked at them with the calm, steady expectation of absolute justice. The judge, a stern older man with zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, entered the room and took his seat high up on the heavy wooden bench. He asked the foreman of the jury if they had reached a unanimous verdict. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a deeply serious expression, stood up and confirmed that they had entirely reached a decision. The judge instructed the defendant to stand and face the jury. Sutton stood up on violently shaking legs. Her overworked public defender had to gently hold her elbow, just to keep her from collapsing right there on the polished floor. She looked at the jury foreman with wide, terrified eyes. The courtroom was so incredibly quiet that you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents in the high ceiling. The foreman opened the folded piece of paper and began to read the formal decisions one by one. On the charge of filing a false police report, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of possession of a Schedule I narcotic, we find the defendant guilty. And finally, on the most severe charge of felony elder abuse resulting in permanent bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the large, quiet room 4 separate times. With each spoken word, Sutton's body physically flinched as if she were being struck by heavy, invisible stones. She let out a sharp, gasping breath, but the judge quickly slammed his wooden gavel, demanding absolute silence in his courtroom. He did not dismiss the jury immediately. He looked directly down at Sutton, his expression entirely devoid of any human sympathy. He told her that he had presided over this specific courtroom for over 20 years and had seen countless violent criminals try to manipulate the system to their advantage. But he stated with absolute clarity that her specific case was one of the most disgusting and arrogant abuses of privilege he had ever witnessed in his entire career on the bench. He told her that she had intentionally tried to weaponize the local police department against an innocent elderly black woman simply to secure a massive financial payout for her own selfish, toxic greed. The judge did not mince his words. He told Sutton that a civilized society is built on the fundamental principle that our elderly citizens deserve ultimate respect and absolute protection. He stated that striking a 74-year-old woman unprovoked in a highly public setting and permanently damaging her hearing was an act of profound cowardice and pure, unadulterated malice. He told her that the tears she was shedding right now were absolutely not tears of genuine remorse. They were simply pathetic tears of regret, because she had finally been caught and cornered by the undeniable truth. He declared loudly that her affluent background, her designer clothes, and her prestigious last name would absolutely not shield her from the harsh, dark reality of the concrete cell she so richly deserved. The judge leaned forward, his dark robes casting a heavy shadow, and delivered the final, crushing blow. He officially sentenced Sutton to serve 3 consecutive years in the state penitentiary system without any possibility of early parole. The heavy sentence fell over the silent courtroom like an incredibly massive iron curtain. 3 years. 36 months of wearing a standard-issued orange jumpsuit. Over 1,000 days of sleeping on a thin, terrible mattress in a crowded, dangerous state prison completely stripped of her identity and her luxury. Sutton's knees completely buckled beneath her. The tired public defender could no longer hold her up, and she dropped heavily into her hard wooden chair. Then the sheer, absolute panic finally consumed her entirely. 2 large, uniformed bailiffs stepped forward from the dark shadows holding heavy, solid metal handcuffs. As they grabbed her arms to pull her up from the chair, the devastating reality of her lost freedom officially broke her fragile mind. She began to scream at the absolute top of her lungs. It was a chaotic, guttural sound of pure animalistic terror. She thrashed wildly against the strong physical grip of the armed officers, looking frantically over her shoulder toward the empty wooden benches at the very back of the room. She screamed for her father. She cried out Richard's name over and over again, begging him to use his massive wealth to stop the officers, to bribe the judge, to do absolutely whatever it took to save his precious little girl from being locked inside a cage. She screamed that she did not belong in a dirty prison and that she was a delicate, educated lady from Charleston. But her desperate screams simply echoed off the completely empty wooden benches. Richard was not there to save her because Richard was currently running in absolute terror for his own pathetic life. What Sutton did not know was that the relentless forensic accountants I had sent into his logistics company during the hostile corporate takeover had found massive, glaring discrepancies in his digital ledgers. They had uncovered 5 years of blatant tax evasion, hidden offshore banking accounts, and massive corporate bankruptcy fraud. I had immediately handed those complete financial files directly over to the federal authorities. The very same morning, Sutton walked into the courthouse to face her criminal trial. Richard and Evelyn had thrown their remaining clothes into the back of a cheap rental car and fled the state of Georgia in the dead of night. They completely abandoned their only daughter to face the merciless jaws of the criminal justice system entirely alone, while they desperately tried to outrun federal arrest warrants. The grand old money family that had looked down their noses at my son and treated my beautiful wife like a common servant had officially scattered like frightened cockroaches when the bright lights were finally turned on. They had absolutely no loyalty to anyone but themselves, and they left Sutton to pay the ultimate absolute price. The bailiffs forcefully dragged Sutton, kicking and screaming, down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her expensive shoes scraped loudly against the polished wood floor. She passed right by the front row where Josephine and I were sitting in absolute calm silence. For one brief, fleeting second, her wild, terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. She was looking at the quiet black man she had called a retired nobody, the incredibly dangerous man whose entire empire she had arrogantly thought she could easily steal. I did not smile at her. I did not gloat or offer her any final parting words of wisdom. I simply looked completely through her with the absolute cold indifference she thoroughly deserved. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the officers pulled her out into the bright hallway. The thick doors slammed heavily shut behind her, completely cutting off her hysterical screaming and plunging the room back into a dignified silence. The silence that returned to the courtroom was incredibly peaceful and deeply satisfying. The judge formally adjourned the court and struck his heavy wooden gavel one final time. The massive legal war was officially completely over. The criminal trial had concluded, the prison sentence was handed down, and the execution was absolute. I stood up from the hard wooden bench and gently offered my right arm to Josephine. She smiled an incredibly warm, genuine smile and slipped her hand softly through my arm. We walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the empty courtroom. We did not rush our steps, and we absolutely did not look back at the defense table. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the bright, beautiful sunlight of the late afternoon. The crisp autumn air felt incredibly fresh and pure as we stepped onto the wide concrete steps of the massive courthouse. The heavy, toxic dark cloud that had hovered over our family since the day of that incredibly disastrous wedding had finally completely dissipated into thin air. We had successfully defended our empire, our human dignity, and our absolute peace of mind. The violent, arrogant cancer that had tried to infect our lives had been surgically and ruthlessly cut out forever. Sutton was going to spend the next 3 years sitting in a tiny concrete box, reflecting on the incredible magnitude of her own absolute stupidity. Her racist parents were currently terrified fugitives, completely stripped of their fake prestige and their stolen wealth. And Andre, the son who had broken my heart through his pathetic, cowardly silence, was completely exiled, left to navigate a harsh, unforgiving world entirely without my money or my protection. We walked slowly down the wide courthouse steps toward our waiting black town car. The professional driver opened the heavy rear door, and we slid into the quiet, luxurious interior. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the busy, rushing Atlanta traffic, I took a long, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. I looked over at Josephine and felt an overwhelming sense of profound, enduring love. The brutal war was finally over, but a completely new chapter of our lives was just beginning. It was time to completely restructure our entire massive legacy. It was time to look toward the bright future and establish the absolute new normal for our peaceful family entirely without the heavy burden of ungrateful children and toxic intruders dragging us down. 6 months have passed since the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed on Sutton's freedom. The brutal winter has melted away into a warm, beautiful spring here in Atlanta. Josephine and I are sitting on the wide wrap-around porch of our Buckhead estate. The afternoon air is thick with the sweet smell of blooming magnolia trees. I'm holding a tall glass of cold iced tea, and the condensation is dripping slowly down the sides of the glass. Josephine is sitting next to me reading a novel in the warm sunlight. Her cheek is completely healed. While she still suffers from a slight permanent hearing loss in her right ear, the profound peace that radiates from her beautiful face more than makes up for the physical scar. Our home is completely silent. It is not the heavy, suffocating silence of a family at war. It is the deep, enduring silence of a fortress that has successfully repelled an invasion and permanently sealed its borders. We spent the last few months meticulously dismantling the old structure of our real estate empire. Since we no longer have an heir to inherit the massive fortune, we decided to completely rewrite our legacy. I called Mr. Caldwell back into my office and we drafted a comprehensive blind trust. Every single corporate asset, every commercial building, and every liquid bank account has been officially transferred into a charitable foundation. When Josephine and I finally leave this earth, our billions will not go into the pockets of ungrateful children or greedy spouses. The money will be used to fund full academic scholarships for underprivileged black students across the state of Georgia. It will be used to provide zero-interest loans to young minority entrepreneurs who are building their own businesses from the ground up. We took the immense power of our wealth and gave it back to the community that actually respects the value of hard work. We ensured that our legacy will build futures instead of funding arrogance. As I sit on the porch taking a slow sip of my iced tea, I hear the loud, rumbling sound of a heavy diesel engine approaching the property. I look down the long, winding cobblestone driveway. A large, battered delivery truck slowly pulls up to the heavy wrought iron gates and comes to a complete stop. I set my glass down on the patio table and watch closely. The heavy metal door of the delivery truck slides open. A young man steps out into the bright afternoon sun. It is Andre. He is not wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He is not wearing an expensive imported watch or designer leather shoes. He is wearing a faded brown uniform shirt that is stained with dark patches of sweat. He is wearing heavy steel-toed work boots that look worn and covered in dust. He walks around to the back of the massive truck, pulls the heavy rolling door up, and hauls a large, heavy cardboard box out of the back. He carries the heavy package up the driveway, his muscles straining under the physical weight of the delivery. He looks exhausted. He looks like a man who has been working a grueling minimum wage job for 10 hours straight. He looks exactly like I did when I was his age, pouring concrete and breaking my back to survive. Andre walks up to the heavy iron gates and gently places the cardboard box down on the stone pillar. He does not ring the intercom bell. He does not fall to his knees and cry. He does not beg for me to let him inside the estate or ask for his platinum credit cards back. He simply stands up straight and wipes the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looks directly up at the primary security camera mounted on the wall. He knows I am watching him. He holds my gaze through the digital lens for a long, quiet moment. Then he gives a single, slow, respectful nod. It is not a plea for mercy. It is an acknowledgement of reality. He turns around, walks back to his delivery truck, climbs into the hot cab, and drives away down the quiet suburban street to finish his daily route. I do not reach for the button to open the gates. I stay sitting in my comfortable chair on the porch, but a genuine, quiet smile slowly spreads across my face. My son is finally learning how to be a real man. Stripping away his unearned millions was the most painful thing I have ever done as a father, but it was also the absolute best thing I could have ever given him. He is finally learning the true value of a dollar. He is learning the heavy consequence of cowardice and the harsh reality of the world. Justice has been entirely served. This entire ordeal has left me with a profound understanding of truth. Blood might dictate who you are related to, but unwavering loyalty dictates who your family is. For generations, society has conditioned older people to swallow disrespect to keep the peace, treating our sacrifices as mandatory and our boundaries as negotiable. But peace built on your own humiliation is just a prison in disguise. I learned that true power is not in the wealth you accumulate, but in your absolute willingness to cut off anyone who mistakes your kindness for weakness. When you stop funding your own disrespect, you do not lose a family, you simply take out the trash and reclaim your dignity. Thank you for listening to my story today. I hope my experience gives you the courage to stand up to the toxic people in your own life, even if they share your last name. Let me know what you thought about my son's new job and Sutton's prison sentence in the comments section down below. Tell me what city or country you are listening from, because I always love reading your responses. If you believe that respect must be earned and disrespect must be punished, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories. See you in the next video.
아니 근데 내 이름이 정말 어쩌면 좋을지 모르겠어. 오빠들이 두라고 해주실 때도 있고 앙이라고 해주실 때도 있는데 두 하면은 둔이랑 겹치고 앙이라고 하면 앙추랑 겹치니까 그래가지고 이름이 참 곤란합니다. 나는 펫? 진짜? 아 재밌겠다. 혼자서 가능하겠어? 혼자서? 컨텐츠 좀 생각해보면 좋긴 한데 일단은 대표님이랑 함께 갈지 말지 여왕 수호권을 쓸지 말지는 모르겠는데 풀빌라 앙키니를 이번에 하긴 해야 합니다. 이거 아니면 답이 없습니다. 물론 이거 한다고 해서 오빠들이 뭐 그렇게 뭐 보실 게 없으니까 많이 좋아하실 것 같진 않지만 봉을 오빠 안녕. 야관문 근데 만들었어 오빠. 이거는 이제 또 밤에 어떤 남자에게 선물하려고 해요.